past few years have been pretty great for Godzilla, with lots of new quality content coming out. Godzilla Minus One has recently become one of the most successful Japanese movies ever made, and even won an Oscar for the first time in the franchise's history. Plus, the American MonsterVerse is still going strong, with multiple spin-off shows and sequels to the films, the latest of which recently became the highest-grossing Godzilla film ever made. Plus, we also got 2 new Godzilla anime, a movie trilogy, and a season of a TV show, and even a bunch of short films, although these aren't available to watch anywhere for some stupid reason. So even though we had to wait quite a while after Shin Godzilla for the next Godzilla movie to release, we still got a bunch of quality content in the meantime to keep the fans satisfied. But despite all this, the one thing that we haven't gotten in recent years is a new video game. This year is Godzilla's 70th anniversary, and we haven't gotten a new big video game since the 60th anniversary in 2014. I know we have been getting mobile games, I mean there's no shortage of those, but we haven't gotten a true Godzilla video game in a decade. And on top of the fact that there's no new games, we can't even go back and enjoy the old games that we like without either paying for overpriced used copies or just straight up pirating them. Plus, most Godzilla games never even released in English. You'd think with a franchise as old and iconic as Godzilla, there'd be a lot more video games to choose from. So that's why I've decided to take a look back at the history of Godzilla games to see just how many of them are actually worth playing. Maybe there will be some hidden gems amongst these that'll hold us over until the next big Godzilla game releases. Whenever that may be. There will be some super old games that you may not have even heard of, some super obscure, and even some fan favorites. Though I'm not going to be playing every single Godzilla game, there are a bunch of Japanese exclusives that are pretty much impossible to play if you don't understand the language, and even a bunch that I wasn't even able to emulate at all. But still, I will try to go over as many of them as possible. So with that out of the way, let's get started with the first game on our list. Luckily, the first Godzilla game ever made was released in America, and it came out for the Commodore PET in 1980. There were many Godzilla games released for various PC systems in the 80s, but being able to actually play them in English isn't a luxury we'll have for most of these. But the reason why this game is in English is because it wasn't made in Japan. In fact, they never even officially got the license to make a Godzilla game. Many Godzilla video game lists don't even count this because they never got the license, and I was even considering not putting this on the list, but since it's the first of its kind, I think it's worth noting. In this game, you don't even play as Godzilla at all, but rather the military. The only thing you'll see is a crude map of Japan with a G on the screen to represent Godzilla, and you just have to use strategy and various weapons and units to try to take him down before he causes massive damage. But since it's an old Commodore game, you gotta type out all your commands. So first I typed TM for troop movement, but after that it asks from to. Well, it says Godzilla is at 1-0, and Tokyo seems to be at 3-3, so I'll move my troops from 3-3 to 3-2, but doing that did absolutely nothing. So then I tried moving my ships instead, since Godzilla will be coming from the sea, but I couldn't figure out where I could even move them. I just kept trying different commands and nothing seemed to be working. But luckily there was a pseudo remake of this game for Commodore 64, also called Godzilla, but this time without the exclamation point. And unlike the previous one, this game is much easier to play and figure out. Plus they even added a cute little Godzilla sprite instead of just making him a G. Although in the previous game, I never even got to see Godzilla. Plus you get more weapons to use in this one. You even get to use an atomic bomb. And although it makes no sense that you could use this to actually kill Godzilla, you could also lose if you drop it anywhere near Tokyo. So I guess it's kind of neat that they added consequences for using it. So I guess if you really were interested in playing either of these games, I'd say pick this one over the first one. But I can't really say I'd recommend you play either of them. I mean, you can just look at this review and you'll pretty much get the gist of what this game's all about. So yeah, at least it's nice that the first review is pretty brief. But actually, this wasn't the only Godzilla game that came out in 1983. There was also a game called Godzilla and the Martians. But we're not going to talk about that one today because, yeah. So let's move on to the real next game on the list, which is also the first true officially licensed Godzilla game. Godzilla vs. 3 Giant Monsters is exactly what the title says. You play as Godzilla and you fight against 3 other monsters, those monsters being Megalon, Kumanga, and King Ghidorah. If I had to pick 3 other monsters for Godzilla to fight in a game like this, Kumanga definitely wouldn't be my first choice. Oh, and Manila is in the game too, but he doesn't show up until the very end. This game released in 1984 for the MSX, which is the Japanese equivalent to the Commodore, but most people just know it as the system that has the original 2 Metal Gear games. And since it released for the MSX, that also means it only released in Japan. Much like the previous game, this one is also very simple. you can pretty much beat the entire game in about 5 minutes if you know what you're doing. The game is just 3 boss fights against each of the kaiju, and you can beat all of them pretty quickly. Pretty much all you have to do is just hit them with your atomic breath a few times and you're done. Though they each have their own unique gimmicks too. The first one you'll fight is Megalon, and he'll emerge from the ground at random points, so all you gotta do is hit him while avoiding those holes. His drilling is pretty much the only attack he can do, and since the atomic breath animation lasts a few seconds, most of the time he'll just walk right into it. Though the range is quite limited, and you're vulnerable while you're doing it, which leaves you open for other attacks. Plus you move around pretty slowly as well. There were a few times where Megalon would just drill a hole right underneath me, and I couldn't move out of the way in time, so I just fell right in and died. If he drills right underneath you, there's pretty much nothing you can do. But here, he just kept coming out of the same hole, so I just stood there and kept hitting him. So because of that, Megalon wasn't too difficult, and I expected that since he is the first boss. But the second boss was a lot harder. You're not just fighting one Kumanga, but 2, and they come out of the holes in the ground that Megalon drilled. So if during the first fight Megalon made a bunch of holes, then that means there's less space for you to move around on, and more places for them to pop out of. So now you're just playing whack-a-mole with 2 giant spiders, but the reason why this fight is a lot harder than the first is because they move a lot faster than you do. If they appear on the other side of the map, then you're not going to get there fast enough in order to hit them. So all you can do is just stand there and dodge their attacks and hope that they come near you. And if you got unlucky with where Megalon placed his holes, then there are some parts where it's pretty much unavoidable to dodge their attacks. And even if you do manage to hit one of them, sometimes it's almost impossible to not get hit by the other one while you're doing your atomic breath. But once I finally managed to beat them, then the third and final monster appears, which of course is King Ghidorah. But this is also where Manila appears, and you have to protect him because if he gets hit, then you lose a life. So in this part, not only are you fighting Ghidorah, but you also have to protect Manila while you're doing it. I personally would have just let that little shit die. Also side note, but look at Godzilla's forward-facing sprite. It looks so dopey. But anyway, despite this being the final boss, I'd say he's actually the easiest of the 3. He flies at the top of the screen and pretty much only attacks downward, so all you have to do is get on his side and just keep blasting him and he'll die pretty easily without even touching you. But once you beat him, the game just resets back to the first fight with Megalon. No victory screen or even a little song. You're just going to be doing the same 3 bosses over and over until you lose all your lives and see what your high score is. But I don't really care about getting a high score in this game, so playing it just once is more than enough for me. So just like the last game, I don't really have much to say about this one. I mean, in this short review, I pretty much showed you everything the game has to offer in just a few minutes. This one's just noteworthy for not only being the first officially licensed Godzilla game, but it's also the first game where you can actually play as Godzilla. It even has a 2-player mode, where you just alternate between lives, so when one person dies, the other player takes over, much like in the original Super Mario Bros. So even though I think this game is much better than the last one, it's way too short and simplistic, so it has 0 replay value for me. It doesn't really have that addictive arcadey appeal that something like Pac-Man has that'll make me want to keep replaying it over and over. The next item on our list is yet another Japanese exclusive game from 1984, but this one is a text-based game, so it's essentially a Godzilla visual novel. There are other text-based Godzilla games too, but this is the only one we'll be talking about. It's not that I think they're bad, I just don't think they're very interesting to talk about or for you to look at if you're watching the review. Plus they're in Japanese, so I wouldn't even be able to play them anyway. But since this one is based on the original 1954 Gojira movie, then you already know the plot, and it even recreates some of the iconic scenes with these MS Paint looking graphics. I would talk about this game more, but I couldn't find a single ROM to emulate this with, and there's very little info on this game online. I couldn't even find any footage of this game. I guess it just makes my life easier, but still, this game is kind of noteworthy for not only being the first of its kind, but Godzilla games that are based on entire films are pretty rare. Though based on what we do know about this game, I wouldn't really say we're missing much by not playing it. Godzilla-kun is yet another Japanese exclusive Godzilla game for the MSX, but this one was released in 1985, and as you can see, they definitely wanted this one to appeal more to kids. As the title suggests, you just play as Godzilla, or in this case, Godzilla-kun, but you also have the biggest rogues gallery of monsters yet. There's Anguirus, Baragon, Mechagodzilla, Rodan, and King Ghidorah. Though, to be honest, if I didn't use the wiki, I probably wouldn't even have been able to figure out what half of these sprites are supposed to be. And the reason why the characters all have these chibi designs is because the game was part of the Godzilla brand of merchandising. It was basically just a bunch of comics, toys, and short cartoons made during the Heisei era to once again market the franchise towards kids. Godzilla may look all cute and cuddly in this game, but here he isn't messing around. He doesn't even need his atomic breath. Instead, he just straight up punches everyone with a big cartoon fist. And then when you do punch enemies, they go flying across the screen. But you don't just use your punch to attack enemies, you can also use it to push rocks out of your way, and if a rock lands on top of an enemy, they explode into a red puddle. Damn. But the purpose of the rocks isn't just to kill enemies, it's also your main objective in each level to destroy all the rocks on the screen. You don't even need to kill the enemies at all it does is increase your score, plus they just respawn immediately anyway. Though the only way to break rocks is just to push them until you can't push them anymore, and then if you punch them once they're stuck, they'll break. So usually that involves pushing them into walls, or into other rocks, or getting them stuck in the water. And once you break all the rocks in a level, arrows will appear that'll lead you to the next stage. Plus sometimes after you break a rock, a power-up will appear. Sometimes it'll be health, or a bomb that'll clear all enemies off the screen, but most of the time I got the time stop one. This may seem like a simple baby game, but it's actually a lot harder than it looks. You can't jump or swim, so if you fall somewhere you can't get out of, you're fucked. Plus, like I said before, enemies will immediately respawn, so you're constantly getting swarmed by enemies while you're trying to break these rocks. And although most of the time just a simple punch will be enough to take them out, each enemy has their own gimmicks, and some of them are pretty annoying to deal with. Baragon can punch much like Godzilla can, although he does it much harder. Mechagodzilla also punches, but his attacks are much faster. Anguirus will charge at you at light speed, and Hedorah has knockback resistance, but the most annoying one of all is Rodan, because he can fly wherever he wants, and sometimes you can't even avoid taking damage from him. You can only punch left or right, so if he's going through platforms to hit you from above, there's nothing you can do. It actually took me way longer to beat the first level than I'd like to admit. But then, after I beat the second level, and I thought I finally had the gameplay loop down, it just brought me right back to the first level. I knew there was no way this game only had 2 levels. I mean, I haven't even seen Ghidorah yet. Well, I later found out that the arrows you walk into at the end of the level actually determine which direction you go on a map that you can't see. So you just gotta remember which direction you've been in, and if you choose the wrong one, it'll send you back to a different level. So once you beat a level, you have to make sure you go into the right arrow. But even after I kept playing this game, I still never saw Ghidorah. I thought that maybe he would only show up in the last level as like a final boss or something, but it turns out he only shows up if you take too long to beat a level. I honestly love when games do this. It just gives you a sense of urgency, and ultimately dread when he arrives, because he could very easily kill you. So then that means once you get to the last level, it isn't Ghidorah that you see at all, but rather Manila. So there's no final boss or anything like that, you just have to save him, and then you beat the game. I honestly don't think this game is terrible. I mean, I kinda like the cute aesthetic, and the gameplay is pretty easy to understand, and despite it being pretty repetitive, there is fun to be had. It's just really satisfying to smash enemies with rocks and punch them across the screen. But I think the biggest problem with this game is that it barely resembles Godzilla at all. You're just moving through mazes, punching rocks, and climbing up vines. The background music in this game gets really annoying very quickly. But one cool thing about this game that I didn't mention is that it has a level maker mode. Yeah, you can actually use the game's assets to make your own level, and that's pretty cool for a game this old. Plus, despite this being a Japanese exclusive, I as an English speaker had no problems picking up and playing it. There was also a sort of port/sequel for this game released for the Game Boy in 1990, and that one actually came out in America and Europe. But the box art for the Western version tricks you into thinking you're playing a more traditional Godzilla game, but instead the game you're actually getting is a chibi creature punching rocks. Plus, to add even more confusion, the title in the West is just Godzilla. I guess it makes sense considering the whole Godzilla-land marketing gimmick isn't exactly a thing over here. So as far as recommending these games go, from what I could tell, the Game Boy version is the improved port. The sprites look better, and the background music isn't nearly as annoying. Plus, they even made some enemies, like Hedorah and Rodan, much less annoying to deal with. But that's only in the Japanese version, since the American version has them act the same as they do on MSX. Plus, Godzilla moves just as slowly as he did in that game. So the Japanese version having a faster move speed is more than enough to make it the superior version, but it also has a completely different story too. In the Japanese version, the final level involves Godzilla saving his girlfriend, Bijira, after she gets kidnapped. But Godzilla isn't saving her alone. Here he gets help from his various family members. So yes, not only does he have a girlfriend here, but there's also Majira, his mother, Hajira, his father, Yojira, who I think is supposed to be one of Godzilla's friends, Kanjira, Godzilla's martial arts sensei, and Itajira, whose only description is necromancer. What the fuck is going on in this game? Of course, none of this is in the English version. Instead, you have to save Manila, who is strangely absent from the Japanese version despite being in the original MSX version. But there are some things about this version that are worse than the original. Like, of course, it being on Game Boy means that there's a severe lack of colors compared to the original, and there's no edit mode. But the quality of life changes, like the password system and map screen, make this version far superior in my opinion. But that's mostly because I think a simple, repetitive game like this lends itself much better to a handheld console. This definitely isn't the best game in the world, but it's not bad. If I was some little boy in the 90s, with way less options for entertainment during a long car ride, I could see myself playing this to kill a few hours. But unfortunately, that's not me, and I got way more games to play. But one last thing, who the hell is Janus? Okay, so now we're getting to games I've actually played before, and this one I actually own no less. It released for the Famicom in December of 1988, and it didn't come out here until almost a year later in 1989. But over here, the game is called Godzilla, Monster of Monsters, which honestly is a way worse title than King of the Monsters, but it's a lot more original than the Japanese title, which of course is just called Godzilla. When you actually boot up the game, it's kind of weird that Godzilla blocks most of the logo. But anyway, before the game starts, there's an extremely long intro that shows this game's original story. It takes place in the year 2000XXX, and the Earth gets invaded by aliens from Planet X, led by King Ghidorah. There's a lot of X's in this game, and I was never really a fan of the 80s and 90s trend of putting the letter X in 21st century dates. I assume it's because they think that not putting a specific date will make it age better, but if anything it just makes it age worse. But anyway, we send Godzilla and Mothra to space to defend the Earth from the aliens, but each level represents a different planet in our solar system, and you get to visit most of them. Wait a minute, this song sounds kind of familiar. Am I crazy, or does this sound like Star Wars? When I first saw the alien ships, I thought they looked like something out of Gurren Lagann, but it's actually supposed to be the Gotengo, a ship which at this point, when the game released, was never in a Godzilla movie. It didn't appear in one until Final Wars in 2004, although it did appear in a Godzilla TV show called Godzilla Island in the late 90s, which was also after this game came out. Sorry, I got a bit sidetracked. So anyway, after the long intro is finally over, you can now start playing the game. And when the game truly does begin, what you're greeted with is probably not what you were expecting at all. It looks like a board game. It seems like we're about to play some sort of Godzilla tabletop game, which admittedly does sound pretty fun, but that is not what this is. Here, you're not only just playing as Godzilla, but you also get to play as Mothra, and you can switch between them whenever you want. This hexagonal board shows where you can move the monsters, and once you finish moving them and your turn ends, the space they land on will determine what happens next, which is usually just a 2D side-scrolling segment. But Mothra can move more spaces than Godzilla, plus she has more range attacks and she can fly, so I figured playing as Mothra was going to be the move. But even though being able to fly over most obstacles is nice, I quickly learned that Mothra actually kinda sucks. Her attacks are really weak, and she gets stun locked way easier than Godzilla does, so I guess the trade-off for her being able to fly and do more range attacks is being extremely weak, where Godzilla is more of a tank. He moves way slower, but he could take a lot more damage than her, and deal more damage too. And both of those attributes are essential to beating this game, so I mostly just played as Godzilla here. The only problem is, since you can't fly over obstacles like Mothra can, getting through these side-scroller parts is way more annoying as Godzilla. You have to stop in your tracks every 5 seconds to destroy rocks that are in your way. And even if you destroy the bottom part of a rock, the top will just float there and you still have to break it. Almost like you're playing Minecraft breaking trees. But even if you were playing as Mothra, it's pretty much impossible to avoid taking damage because there's just so many projectiles coming from all directions. But at least when you break a rock or kill an enemy, they'll usually drop health, and they're pretty generous with the drops. Besides that though, these parts play fine, I guess. I mean, they're more of what you'd expect from an NES Godzilla game, but the levels are just so boring. I just kept moving right while spamming the attack button, and as Godzilla I did this tail slide move to get through the levels quicker. Each character has 3 attacks. For Godzilla, A is punch and B is kick, but for Mothra, both A and B seem to do the exact same thing, though if you press start, the character will do a special move that'll drain their power meter. For Godzilla, that's of course his atomic breath, which is really powerful, so it drains a lot of your meter. But Mothra does this weird bomb attack where she drops her wings down below. It's pretty awkward to do, but it wastes a lot less meter than Godzilla's special. So if start is attack, then that means select is actually the pause button, and since both A and B are also attacks, then that means you have to press up to jump. Normally I don't like it when games like this use up to jump, but since this game doesn't require any sort of crazy platforming, it's fine here. But these side-scrolling sections can go on for some time. Even when you think you're done, you'll just transition to the next screen and it's just more of the same. Though these would go a lot faster if I didn't have to stop and break all these damn rocks. But of course, rocks aren't your only obstacle in these stages. There are dragon heads, flaming phoenixes, and volcanoes in the background that for some reason hit you in the foreground. Yeah, there are some bizarre enemies here for a Godzilla game. But in typical Godzilla fashion, you're also going to be fighting against tanks and jets. Wait a minute, I thought the military was on our side, because Godzilla and Mothra are supposed to be protecting Earth in this game. So then why the hell are they attacking us? But after you beat the side-scrolling levels, the CPU then gets to make their move. And if you or the CPU interact with each other, then you get to fight. You'd think the monster boss fights would be the highlight of this game, but they actually make me wish I was playing the side-scroller parts instead. Especially if you're playing as Mothra, because you'd think her ranged attacks and flight would help a lot during a boss fight, but she barely does any damage to them, and you keep getting stun-locked by their attacks. Even her special attack is useless, because it's hard to get a good angle on them in order for the wings to drop onto the enemy. At least if one of them dies, you can keep playing as the other monster, and the enemy's health will remain the same, so all the damage I did as Mothra stayed when I fought them as Godzilla. You just have to ensure that you're able to make it over there in your turn. Then when I actually got to fight them as Godzilla, the bosses actually became piss easy. When I fought against Mogera, I was able to stun lock him with my tail attack, and he just did no damage to me. But the bosses are just an obstacle, because in order to actually beat the stage, you have to get to the part on the board where these little buildings are. So you don't even actually need to fight the bosses at all, if you're able to bypass them at least. But it is still highly recommended that you do fight the bosses, because this game also has a leveling system. So once you beat bosses, it actually levels up your health and power meter. And even though the bosses in this level were piss easy, you're going to need all the help you can get for the future levels. But once I beat Mogera and Gazora, in the next stage I got to fight Mogera and Gazora again. Also, this time Varan is here. So as you progress through the game, each time you enter a new stage, they'll add one more boss to the mix on top of all the other bosses that you already fought in the previous stage. So in the next stage, not only are you fighting Mogera, Gazora, and Varan, but you also have to fight Hedorah too. Then in the next stage, they add Anguirus. Then in the stage after that, they add Gigan too, and so on. So even if you have no trouble fighting these bosses, just the sheer amount of them by the end of the game becomes ridiculous. And even though I just said it's recommended that you beat as many bosses as you can in order to level up, these boss fights are definitely the worst part of the game, and you're going to need to do a lot of them in order to actually beat this. I mean, I'm not exactly expecting these one-on-one fights to feel like Street Fighter, especially on a console like the NES, but even if you're leveled up, these bosses feel like hit sponges, and you can even get kicked out in the middle of a fight if you get your ass beat, even if you have enough health left to keep fighting. And this gets even worse if Godzilla dies and I have to fight these bosses as Mothra, which I explained before is extremely excruciating, but at least if I beat the boss as Mothra, then in the next stage Godzilla comes back and I can use him again. But don't worry, because even though there are a ton of boss fights in this game, there's going to be even more boring side-scrolling segments for you to complete that take even longer. It's a shame, because this is the first Godzilla game we've looked at that actually has real monster fights, and the variety of monsters you do get to fight is pretty expansive. And there are some things to appreciate about this game too, like the sprites and music are actually pretty decent, but this game is just way too frustrating and repetitive for me to actually recommend it, which is an issue that plagues many NES games. I mean, they're not exactly known for being easy, but this game actually has a lasting legacy beyond just being a bad Godzilla game. In recent years, there's been a pretty infamous creepypasta based on this game. I mean, I don't really care for it, but it's pretty much the only noteworthy thing about this game, because as a Godzilla game, this leaves a lot to be desired. Godzilla Monster of Monsters got a sequel only a few years later, except this game was made in America and has pretty much nothing to do with the first one, and never even got released in Japan. At least it got a better title. It's called Godzilla 2 War of the Monsters, and it was released on the NES in 1992. So I guess they just called it Godzilla 2 because the first one sold well, and they figured they'd use the name to trick people into buying a completely different game. The box art does a good job of this too, since they use the fantastic Return of Godzilla poster art on the cover. So unlike the previous game, you don't get to play as Godzilla, or any monster for that matter. This is a strategy game where you play as the military and you build and move around various vehicles and troops on a grid-like map to defend structures and attack the monsters. So I guess it does have some similarities with the first game, since both of them are sort of like board games. And much like the first one, once you interact with a monster, you go into fight mode. Although unlike the first game, when you do battle a monster, it's more like a turn-based RPG, and randomness in RPGs can already be frustrating enough, but in this game, the thing that determines how much damage your attack does, or even if the attack lands at all, is a slot machine. At least you don't have to get 3 in a row, but I still haven't figured out what any of these symbols mean. It might as well just be completely random. I have no idea why they decided to use this slot machine mechanic. I'd rather just select the attack and let the RNG handle the rest. But on top of the fact that you have to get lucky to even hit the monsters, they have way more health and do way more damage than you do. Plus, if you don't take them down quickly, they heal every turn. So even if you do surround these monsters with as many troops as you can, in order to take them out as quickly as possible, you're still at the mercy of this slot machine. So since you can only move each unit a limited amount of spaces per turn, Your strategy is just ensuring that the monsters are constantly getting barraged with as many attacks as possible. But it's kinda hard to be strategic when all that can just amount to nothing if you're just really unlucky. But even if the game does decide to throw you a bone and give you some good spins on the slot machine, it takes forever to kill a single monster. I mean, pretty much everything in this game takes forever. It's just so slow and boring, and the repetitive music certainly doesn't help. Luckily, you don't need to beat every level in order to see the whole game, since you can just select whatever level, or in this case scenario, you want. There's 12 to choose from, and to be honest, some of these titles are pretty intriguing, but I really don't want to play more of this game to check them all out, so I just went straight to the last one. In the first level, you're given a huge army of tanks and jets at your disposal, and even that level was pretty hard. But in this level, you have to build all the units yourself, so it's kind of like StarCraft. But building units takes time, and you have a very limited number of units you can even make. And even once I got all the units fully built, it still wasn't enough to take out all these monsters. Though there are 3 parts that you can build and deliver to a specific location, and once all 3 are delivered, it creates the best jet in the game. But even with the combined forces of that jet and the Super X2, I still wasn't able to beat this level. The combat in this game is just way too unforgiving. Despite my strength in numbers, the game is just too heavily stacked in favor of the monsters. Although I guess you could say that's more movie accurate. Plus in this level you have to fight pretty much every monster in the game, well except Mothra. I thought just fighting Godzilla and Baragon was bad, but here it's them, plus King Ghidorah, Rodan, Hedorah, and a UFO. This seems like one of those games where having the manual is essential, but luckily you can talk to these 3 scientists and they'll give you various tips. There's Dr. Wagner, who just looks like Albert Einstein, Dr. Dickens, who seems to have a cute little Godzilla skeleton model in her lab, and of course there's Dr. Zarazawa. It's kind of funny that in this game he encourages you to use the Oxygen Destroyer against the monsters. I wish I knew how to though. Let's try asking Dr. Dickens for help instead. Oh. Never mind, I guess. I wasn't really a fan of the first NES Godzilla game, and I definitely like this one a lot less. A Godzilla strategy game could be fun, but this game was way too slow, frustrating, and unforgiving for me to want to continue playing. I don't even think removing the slot machine and making the combat more akin to a traditional strategy game would help this game much. Though the last thing I'll say is that I love that the victory screen when you beat Godzilla is him holding a little white surrender flag. This is the first handheld Godzilla game we'll be looking at today, excluding the brief review I did on Godzilla-kun for Game Boy. This game was only released in Japan in 1993 for the Game Boy, and the gameplay is somewhat reminiscent of Monster of Monsters for NES, but just the side-scrolling parts. But unlike that game, Earth actually looks like Earth, which means you get to destroy buildings in this one. But before you can do any of that, you have to actually wade through the ocean before you can get to the city. So you'll be walking to shore in the ocean while fighting against battleships, helicopters, and jets. Of course there are monsters to fight too, and you'd think the bosses would be at the end of the stage, but no, in each stage there are multiple monsters to fight, and they're essentially like mini-bosses scattered throughout the level. Another thing that makes this game similar to the NES Godzilla is that there's a huge variety of monsters to fight against, which is nice, but unfortunately another thing that's similar to the NES game is that the fights in this feel very slow and clunky, except that it's made even worse by the fact that this is on Game Boy. In this game you just have 2 attacks, Atomic Breath and a weak-ass punch, so the only reason you'd ever punch someone is if you don't have enough meter to use your Atomic Breath, but in this game, that meter is also your health. So as long as you have enough health, you can just hold down the button and demolish enemies with your Atomic Breath, but the more you use it, the more it goes down. But your health is also going down from the constant barrage of projectiles being fired at you from every direction. So I just found it easier to not even fight against the enemies at all and just kind of walk past them. I guess this game really is very similar to Monster of Monsters. At least in this game, a lot of the enemies can be killed by just stepping on them. At first I thought the only way to heal was after beating a boss, because once they're defeated, you gain a little bit of health, but actually you just heal if you stand completely still. I mean, the ability to regenerate your health automatically is nice and everything, but the meter goes up so slowly, and just standing there waiting for your health to fully replenish for a full minute gets really boring and tedious. It would have made more sense for enemies to drop health power-ups at random, then at least it would give you more incentive to actually fight them. But the fact that I can replenish all of my health pretty much whenever I want makes this game extremely easy. So all I'm doing is just slowly moving right through the stage while tanking all the damage that's coming my way, because then right before the boss I can just heal all my health. So then once I fight the boss with a full health bar, I can just eviscerate them with my Atomic Breath. Even though I've been pretty harsh on this game so far, I don't think it's actually that bad. I will say though, the sprites are actually quite good for Game Boy, and I love the way Godzilla stomps make the screen shake. I mean, for a Godzilla game, it's pretty much exactly what you'd expect. You're destroying buildings, stomping on the military, and fighting against other monsters. And even though the game is extremely easy, to the point where the gameplay starts to become very boring, it does add to that power fantasy of what it would feel like to actually be Godzilla. Though I feel like this game would be better if it wasn't on the original Game Boy. It just feels very clunky and slow, and the gameplay gets very repetitive very quickly. So although I wouldn't necessarily say it's a good game, I would say it's alright for an original Game Boy game, and a pretty decent handheld Godzilla game. But although being able to experience what it would actually feel like to be Godzilla does sound fun on paper, like stomping around cities, destroying military vehicles, and fighting against a huge assortment of monsters, in practice it doesn't always make for the best game since these monsters are very slow and lumbering. But maybe in the future, and on a more powerful console, they'll find a way to make this more fun. So far we've seen some strategy games, side-scrollers, puzzle games, and a visual novel, but all I really want is just a good Godzilla 2D fighting game. All the games we've looked at that have featured 1v1 kaiju fighting have been pretty lackluster so far, plus they're usually just boss fights and side-scrollers anyway. Well, in 1993 I got my wish when Godzilla was released for arcades, but of course it's only in Japan. It's pretty much got what you'd expect from a fighting game from this era. It's got a single-player arcade mode, 2v2 versus battles, combos, special moves, and a variety of stages. And although the roster is kinda small, and the gameplay can be a bit clunky at times, it is a lot of fun, especially with friends. The game does make up for some of its shortcomings though by having a more fleshed out single-player mode. Normally in arcade fighting games from this era, you'll just be fighting against some of the playable characters in the roster as they're controlled by a CPU, but here you can also fight against non-playable boss characters like Biolante and Batra. But you aren't just fighting monsters either, because before you get to the fight, you have to walk through the stage and cause as much destruction as possible. And just when I thought I was done with side-scrollers, but here I actually think it's a welcome addition. I kinda like it when fighting games like this have single-player modes that aren't just the same 1v1 fights over and over. Plus, it's not like these stages get annoying either, because you can't even really die. Even when the military is shooting missiles at you, you don't take any damage. You just have to destroy as many things as possible to get a high score. But the purpose of these levels isn't just to get a high score, because the more things you destroy, the more your special meter fills up. So doing well in these stages will also benefit you greatly at the start of your fight. Each level is meant to represent a different Godzilla film, but since you're going through each film in Godzilla's history, that means you can only play as Godzilla. But it's still cool to be able to see new characters and locations that aren't in versus mode. But once you get to the real meat of this game, you'll find that the CPU is actually pretty tough. Though granted, I'm not the best at fighting games, but some of the combos in this game are actually pretty difficult to pull off. I mainly just resorted to mashing buttons for a lot of this fight, so I guess it is my fault for getting my ass kicked. Although it is weird that this game has a dedicated jump button instead of mapping it to up like most fighting games. I wasn't able to progress that far in the story because of my lack of fighting game skills, but there is one part that is genuinely bullshit, and even if I was good at fighting games, I think I'd still have a very hard time beating it. There's one level where you have to fight against Gigan, and once you do beat him, the level just keeps going, and you have to fight Megalon on the same health bar, and it doesn't replenish. Although I guess it doesn't matter that I wasn't able to beat the single player, because when it comes to fighting games like this, it's most important to have a fun multiplayer mode. And the 1v1 kaiju fights in this game are some of the most fun I've had in any of these Godzilla games we've looked at so far. This game isn't perfect though, because at times the combat can feel a bit stiff. And I feel like I'm being a bit biased because I've mostly been looking at nothing but mediocre and bad games so far. But I'd still say this is definitely the best game we've looked at so far, and it's definitely worth checking out. The graphics are pretty great in this game, and the monsters all sound like they should, and they even manage to make all their moves feel unique, even though the combat can be a bit simple at times. I mean, speaking of unique moves, Godzilla shoots this weird bubble thing for some reason, and he has this funny tailspin attack that's kind of like the tornado kick from Street Fighter. Plus, it doesn't bother me that much that the game plays a bit slower than other fighting games, since this is a game where you're playing as giant monsters. It's obviously not the best fighting game in the world, but as far as Godzilla games go, it might as well be a masterpiece. It's a shame this game only released in Japanese arcades, because if it got a home console release, it would be a lot more accessible to people now, and maybe it would have even gotten a Western port. Though it's not like you really need to understand Japanese in order to play this game, but still, I just hope that soon we can actually find a good Godzilla game that was released here in America. So now that we've entered the 16-bit era, surely these games will start to get better, right? I mean, the last game was pretty good, and this one's called Super Godzilla, so it has to be good. Plus, they even use my favorite Godzilla poster ever for the box art. This game released on the SNES in America in 1994, and when you boot it up, you're treated to a pretty cool 16-bit rendition of the Godzilla theme song. Although the graphics and sounds for this game do look promising, unfortunately when you boot up the game you'll probably be immediately frustrated and confused as to what the hell is going on. Naturally, you're going to want to focus on the top half of the screen because that's where Godzilla is, but that's just a visual representation of what's going on the bottom half of the screen, which is actually what you're supposed to be paying attention to. That little blue dot right there is Godzilla, and he moves on his own, but you can guide him to go in any direction you want, and you're going to have to move him to the end of the map until you find a pink dot, which is another monster for him to fight. Although it seems like you're playing as Godzilla, you're actually playing as the military who's controlling him and using him to fight against the other monsters. But despite that, the military is still gonna attack you. So not only do you have to worry about the military draining your health, but you know what else drains your health? Walking into buildings. Godzilla is able to destroy them with ease, but since the military is controlling him, they want to keep destruction to a minimum. So if you do walk into a building, it depletes some of your health. So not only is the military attacking you for no reason, but they're also doing it while you're consciously trying not to destroy as many things as possible. But the things you do want to walk into are these blue squares because they give you power-ups, so you're going to have to collect as many as possible while also losing as little health as possible so you can become as strong as you can be for when you fight the stage's boss. And you're going to need as many power-ups as you can get, because not only are some of these boss fights pretty hard, but much like the walking segments, when I played this for the first time, I was extremely confused as to what the hell I was supposed to be doing. Just based on what this looks like, you'd expect it to play like a 1v1 fighting game, but if you just charge at the enemy and try spamming attacks at them, you're going to lose. You just have to hit the enemy once, then immediately back away from them, because that lets you choose a special attack with L and R. The main thing that confused me was what the hell those two colored lines were supposed to be. They just keep moving back and forth, seemingly without any rhyme or reason. Well, those are supposed to represent your fighting spirit, and the length of that meter is what determines how much damage you do. But since the meter moves at random, you just have to hope it's high enough to do enough damage. And you're gonna have to repeat this little dance for a while until the monster is dead, but then after that, you're only rewarded with more walking segments. You'd think after several minutes of slow, boring walking, I'd actually be happy to see some 1v1 kaiju action, but these are actually even worse than the walking parts. Except now, after you've beaten the first level, there's gonna be random encounters in the stages. I complain about the walking parts being boring because you're mostly just moving to the other end of the stage while avoiding obstacles, but the random encounters just make it go from boring to annoying. Since you're going to have to go off the beaten path a lot in order to get power-ups, you're going to get a lot of random encounters. But did I mention these parts are timed? So if you get hit with too many random encounters, it's going to waste time and you're going to end up losing. Though it seems the only enemies that you randomly encounter are these UFOs, and they at least die pretty quickly, but they also appear way too frequently. Though you can stop the UFOs from spawning if you take out the mothership, but getting to it is way easier said than done. It's just another thing that takes up your time, so if anything, it's usually better to just avoid it entirely. When I got to the boss of this stage, at first I was kind of annoyed because it seemed to just be a palette-swapped version of Godzilla. But it's actually a cute little reference, because as soon as you hit him once, it's revealed that he's actually Mechagodzilla. And even though this is a reference to the original Showa-era Mechagodzilla movie, in the Japanese version they don't use his Showa design at all, it's actually Heisei Mechagodzilla, but I guess they just changed his sprite in America because the Heisei-era Mechagodzilla 2 movie didn't come out here yet, though the sprite they did use makes him look kinda chunky. One cool thing about this game is that the name Super Godzilla isn't just the typical Super Nintendo gimmick of having the word super in every game's title. Towards the end of the game, you can actually transform into Super Godzilla, and you fight against Mecha King Ghidorah and the game's final boss, Bagan. At first I just thought Bagan was an original character made for this game, much like Super Godzilla, but no, it's actually a monster they planned to use in several films, but it just never came to fruition. It's a shame they never actually used him in a movie, because he has a cool design, and now his legacy is just being the final boss of this crappy game. Super Godzilla has a pretty cool design too, plus they even use it as the inspiration behind Space Godzilla's design. And the Super Godzilla transformation isn't just for the kaiju fights, you can use him in the walking parts too, although there is a time limit on how long he can sustain this form. Though the best thing about it is that now when you walk into buildings, it no longer does damage. Although Bagan and Super Godzilla are pretty neat, I can't really say the same about the game itself. One of the worst things a game could be is boring, and that goes double for Godzilla games. I mean, you really have to try to make a game about giant monsters fighting and destroying buildings as boring as this. Though it being a Super Nintendo game means the graphics and sound are pretty great, but even that, plus a cool new original form for Godzilla, doesn't save this game. The last game we looked at seemed to be a diamond in the rough, and now that we're on a new generation of consoles, I was hoping these games would be getting better, but if anything, it's only gotten worse. I mean, it is cool that they repurposed this kaiju design for the final boss of this game, but the gameplay just feels way too restrictive and boring. I guess the restrictiveness does make sense considering Godzilla is being controlled by the military in this game against his will, but the only way I'm ever going to play this game again is if I'm being controlled against my will. Godzilla Battle Legends, also just known in the West as, you guessed it, Godzilla, was released for the PC Engine and Turbo Duo in 1993. The Turbo Duo is basically just a TurboGrafx 16 with a CD-ROM attached to it, kind of like the Sega CD. It's basically like owning an arcade machine that you can play on your TV at home, and since this is a fighting game, much like Godzilla for arcade, this gives me high hopes that we could actually get a good Godzilla fighting game on home consoles now. But since this is a home console game, the graphics aren't as good as arcade, but this one actually feels a lot less stiff than Godzilla for arcade. This game also has a much more impressive roster. You only start out with 3 characters, but you unlock more as you progress through the story mode. But even on easy, I was having a tough time, so I wasn't able to unlock them all on my own. Much like the first arcade game, in this one you can only play as Godzilla in the story mode. Not only that, but in versus mode, you can't play against a CPU, you can only fight against other players. At least you can still play with your friends, but since I don't have anyone to play with, I wasn't able to practice with CPUs to get better at the game, so my only option was to just play the story mode. Though I guess I could have just plugged in a second controller and pretended I was playing training mode, but where's the fun in that? I would have rather the game just come with a training mode, or better yet, just let me fight against the CPU. I don't see why I can't considering I could do that in the story mode. But at least this time around in versus mode, they actually let you pick the stage, and you can even select the background music too. The stages themselves are pretty cool too, especially since there are buildings and other objects that you can destroy by knocking your opponent into them or smashing into them yourself with an attack, which makes the fights feel a lot more like an actual kaiju battle. But when it comes to the single player, even though you can only play as Godzilla, the game does make up for this by giving him a ton of different skins. Each sprite is meant to represent one of his different designs from various films. And as far as I know, this is the only game so far that does this, so it's a pretty great touch. And although this game doesn't have the side-scroller sections before fights, they did bring back the non-playable bosses, plus you can even select between different monsters to choose who you get to fight next. In this part, I chose to fight against the Super X2 because I figured it'd be easier to fight against a ship rather than another monster, but this little bastard is so small, it's annoying to hit, but at least it's cool that you can actually play as the Super X2 in versus mode. So who you choose to fight and how well you do determines how many points you get, but the points aren't just for a high score. How many points you get also determines who you can fight. If you don't have a certain amount of points, then the game will deem you unworthy to fight certain monsters. Though getting more points is easier said than done because it factors in things like how fast you can beat the enemies and how little damage you take. And as I've established before, I'm not very good at fighting games, so this was a very difficult task for me. Though this game has a much more simple control scheme than the arcade game. Much like that game, this uses one of the face buttons to jump, but since this controller only has 2 buttons, that means you only have 1 button to use for attack. It does make the moveset a bit more limited, but your attacks change depending on if you're crouching, jumping, or holding the button. You can even do quarter circles to do a special move. So despite having only 1 attack button, I think the controls in this game are a lot more fluid. Plus, despite the difficulty, I had a lot of fun with the single player too. I really like the way they incentivize you to actually do well in fights, while also letting you choose which character you want to fight against. Even though this game isn't as technically impressive as an arcade game, it still has very good graphics and sound. Plus, I can look past worse graphics on a home console, especially if the gameplay is fun. My only real gripe with this game, besides the fact that I can't fight against the CPU, is that I wish the jump button was mapped to up, and they used that second face button for another attack. But despite those flaws, I would still say this game is a really fun time with friends. I would even recommend it over Godzilla Arcade, since this game has a much more impressive roster, and the controls feel much better. It's nice that we finally have our first good Godzilla game that was actually released in the West, even though nobody really owned it or played it. Next up on our list is yet another fighting game. If I reviewed Super Godzilla before the arcade game, then that would have been 3 fighting games in a row. This one released on the Super Famicom in 1994, so yes, at least this one actually released on a console people owned, but since I said Famicom before, that means it only released in Japan. This game is known in Japan as Godzilla Kaiju Daikessen, but over here we just call it Godzilla Great Monster Battle. But just when I was starting to think that it was a shame that Battle Legends released in the West on a console nobody owned, and this game was Japan exclusive and released on a console that way more people owned. But once I started playing it, I realized that this game is pretty much just a Super Nintendo port of Battle Legends, except since this is a Super Famicom game, that means it's on weaker hardware. The sprites and sound aren't nearly as good in this game. At least in the single-player mode, they let you play as more monsters besides Godzilla, but that means they also don't have the various Godzilla designs like Battle Legends does. Though there are some playable characters that you still can't select in story mode, like Mechagodzilla and... oh, I guess the Gotengo's in this game? So that means you can play as it in Versus mode too. I mean, the last game had Super X too, so I guess it makes sense. I do like it when fighting games have weird roster picks like this sometimes. Although in Versus mode, there still isn't a way to fight against the CPU, but the single-player mode lets you pick whatever monster you want to fight, so it basically is a Versus CPU mode. But there are still some characters missing that you can't fight against. You can even select the difficulty too. One of them is called Practice mode, which I thought would basically just be training mode, but it's actually just easy mode. The CPU still fights against you, so the only way to really win in single-player mode is just to fight all these monsters one-on-one. But this game actually addresses one of the biggest complaints I had with the previous game, which was that it only has one attack button. The game actually makes use of all the buttons on the SNES controller, so that means now you can do a heavy attack, light attack, grab, and even dash. So even though this game does have some aspects that are worse than Battle Legends, I would still say all these improvements make this the superior game. I just wish we got this game in America instead of Super Godzilla. It seems we're always getting the short end of the stick with these ports. Even though Battle Legends did release in English, nobody in America really owned a Turbo Duo. So hopefully in the future we'll get more English Godzilla games, and maybe they'll also release a new fighting game on a less obscure console. Judging by the title of this one, I probably don't have to tell you that this one didn't release in the West. At least it's not another fighting game though. But this one also released on a very obscure console. It's called Godzilla Doki Doki Monster Island, also just known as Godzilla Heart-Pounding Monster Island, with 2 exclamation points. It released for the Sega Pico, which is hardly even a video game console. It's more like the Sega equivalent to the Leapfrog, so it's an educational system designed for very small children. But that makes this the first Godzilla game released on a Sega system. It's kinda weird that there was never a Godzilla game released on the Genesis, although the Sega Pico does use Genesis hardware. This game did get a port though. The Sega Pico version came out in 1995, and a PC version was released 4 years later in 1999. I only looked at the Pico version of this game, but I would have played the PC version too. Only problem is it's basically impossible to find or even emulate. I guess that works out for me though, because that means less baby games for me to play. But I guess if there's one thing I associate with Godzilla, it's children's education. Because of that, this game does use a very cutesy, chibi art style, although it's not Godzilla-kun at all. The designs here are much more reminiscent of what the original monsters actually look like, and there are some pretty obscure ones here too, like the Gargantuas. The Sega Pico doesn't use a traditional controller. Instead, it's sort of like this little booklet with pictures on it, and you touch it with a stylus in order to interact with the game. The booklet itself also doubles as a cartridge that you plug into the console, so each game comes with its own unique one. There are buttons on the Pico too, but you usually just use one button and the D-pad. Cause as you would imagine, the controls for these games are extremely simple. I guess emulating this game isn't the best way to experience it, since a large part of this game is using the stylus to touch on these various pictures that the game comes with. But this game is basically just a collection of various, very simple minigames. One of them you have to jump with balloons and grab stars, one is a memory game, and one of them is kind of like a mini Frogger-like game, where you have to jump on platforms to get to Manila. The game that looks the most fun is the one where you use your stylus to draw your own kaiju, and you can even make them fight. But if you wanted, you could also just free draw, or use it as a virtual coloring book. I think this alone makes it worth the price of admission, although since this is a game for young children, I can't really say I'd recommend this one. The next game on our list is yet another Japanese-exclusive Sega Godzilla game, although this time it released on the Sega Saturn in 1995. This is another game where you get to take control of the military rather than the monsters, but this one is more of a battle simulator than a strategy game or an RPG. You command your troops on this isometric map and position them so that they can attack Godzilla and other monsters as they rampage across Japan. You can even summon helpful monsters that will fight on your side. Watching the monster you summoned fight against the enemy Kaiju while you're trying to kill Godzilla is actually pretty cool. I'll just sit back and watch them duke it out. A Godzilla battle simulator is actually a neat idea, and since it's on the Sega Saturn, the graphics and sound are actually pretty good. Only problem is, this game is pretty damn hard. I couldn't really figure out how to actually beat Godzilla, and when he did die, it felt like luck rather than skill. I think that mostly stems from the fact that this game only released in Japan, so I can't really understand what any of the text on the screen says. I guess making the Kaiju really difficult to fight against does make this a more authentic battle simulator since you're playing as the military in this one, but that also just makes it feel extremely frustrating. Especially since early on, the monster fights are pretty easy and you can beat them with very little strategy, but as the game goes on, they get much harder. Maybe if this game got an English patch, I would have a better time, since I certainly don't hate the game. I mean, it's a neat idea with decent enough execution, plus a modern version of this concept would actually be really fun. But until we either get that, or just a translation of this game, I can't really play much more of this. Godzilla Kaiju no Daishin Geki, otherwise known in English as Godzilla Monsters Attack or Godzilla Monster March, not to be confused with Godzilla Great Monster March for Game Boy, is yet another Japanese exclusive game also released in the year 1995, except this one is a handheld, only releasing on the Sega Game Gear. But despite being Japan exclusive, this game actually got an English fan translation, and honestly if it didn't, I probably wouldn't have been able to play this game. Like a lot of handheld Godzilla games, this one opts for a chibi aesthetic, but I find this game's art style much more appealing than Godzilla-kun. At least the monsters here somewhat resemble their original designs. I mean, in general, the graphics are actually quite nice for a Game Gear game, but wait a minute, Super Godzilla's in this game too? Except here he's gray and the original Godzilla is green. According to the description, Super Godzilla is just what they call Godzilla after he merges with Fire Rodan, like in the Heisei Mechagodzilla movie. This compendium is actually a neat feature. I like being able to read all the character descriptions. But anyway, let's get to the real game. When I first started playing this game, it reminded me a lot of Godzilla 2 on NES. In fact, I'd go as far to say this game is almost like a remake of that one, but like all great remakes should, this game actually improves on pretty much everything from Godzilla 2. The graphics are much better, the music is way less annoying, the game plays much faster, and of course there's no damn slot machine in this one. In this game, when you enter into combat, it's actually sort of like a 2D fighter. You can freely move around and jump, and attack with 2 attack buttons. But if you press them both together, you can do an ultimate move. So the fights in this game aren't turn-based, and the combat only ends once either of you are killed or the very short timer runs out. So if anything, it's more like they merged both NES Godzilla games into one, while only maintaining the best aspects of each game. It's certainly not the greatest combat in the world, but in a game like this, it's a surprisingly welcome addition. But the biggest improvement this game has over Godzilla 2 is that in this one you can actually play as both the military and the monsters. If you play as the monsters, you can pretty much destroy most military vehicles in a single hit, but it's balanced by the fact that you only have one life and they have multiple. And if you don't destroy all of them before your time limit runs out, then they can retaliate against you. But if you're able to attack them again during your next turn, then they'll only have a few lives left and you can pick them off easier. Plus, naturally, the monsters have way more health and do more damage than the military, so destroying buildings and military vehicles is pretty satisfying. But your objective isn't just to wipe out all their units, you can also win by destroying certain buildings. Each level is different though, but there are only 4. Well, there is a secret 5th level you unlock once you complete all 4. Each level is based on a different Heisei-era Godzilla movie, but the secret level is based on the original 1954 Godzilla. That is neat, though because of this, that stage feels a lot more lackluster than the other 4. In the other stages there are usually multiple monsters, but here you can only play as Godzilla. But even though there are so few levels, it's not really a big deal because since you can play as both Godzilla and the military, it means you'll be replaying each level twice, so that actually doubles the level count. I mean, you are just playing the same level twice, but the experience is very different and it adds a lot of replayability. But once you play as the military, even though at first it'll seem like you're heavily outmatched against the monsters, you have strength in numbers, as well as a much greater variety in the different ways you can attack. I mean, you got jets, tanks, battleships, the Super X, And you can even have the mecha monsters fight with you, like Mogera, Mecha King Ghidorah, and Mecha Godzilla. You can even take control of the Garuda and combine it with Mecha Godzilla once he appears to create Super Mecha Godzilla. And of course you can also use Mothra as an ally too. I guess based on all this, it may seem like the military is the superior choice, but defending the city is a lot more difficult than just destroying it. Like I said before, if you choose to play as the Kaiju, your objective is mainly to just destroy the military and certain buildings. But here, if you play as the military, you have to actually defend these buildings, and if the monsters destroy too many, then you lose. This is also where the real difficulty of this game comes in, because on top of all that, you also have a limited amount of turns. So even if during a stage I was doing well fighting against the enemy, it was very difficult for me to complete it before I ran out of turns. The one thing that's annoying when you play as the monsters is that you spend a lot of time waiting. You have to wait for every single military unit to complete their turn, and sometimes this can take upwards of a minute. So if you're not playing this on an emulator and you can't fast forward it, it's really annoying to have to sit there and wait for the enemy to complete their turn. So even though this game can be pretty difficult and annoying at times, I actually found it to be pretty great. This is exactly what I wanted out of Godzilla 2. It's just a fun strategy game where you can play as both the military and the monsters, and it's on a handheld console no less. So since this game got a fan translation just a few years ago, I highly recommend checking this one out. This next game is something I'm hesitant to even call a game, so I was debating even putting it on the list at all, especially since getting this one to work was the biggest pain in the ass out of all of these games. But we've been looking at a lot of Japanese exclusives recently, so it's nice to get a game that you can actually play in America, although it wasn't released in English until 2 years after its release in 1996, so it didn't come out in America until 1998 for both the PC and Mac. But the reason I said this isn't really a game is because all you're doing here is taking clips from various Godzilla movies and splicing them together to make your own. But that's not the only thing you'll be doing here, since for some reason they went with this sci-fi theme park aesthetic. But instead of simply just walking around the park, you're going to be riding around in this flying pod thing. So before we make our own movie, let's explore the park a bit. First there's this skywalk, which basically just gives you a 3D tour of the whole park. Then there's the two shops. One is just called the Godzilla shop, and the other is basically the same thing, but for kids. And both shops are just there to let you print out pictures. Though the kids one is more for activities, like birthday cards and coloring book pages. That actually sounds kind of fun, so let's print one out. Oh, never mind. To make this shop feel even more kid-friendly, they got this cartoony Godzilla pic dancing around with this strange music in the background. Then there's the library, where you can take a look at almost every single Godzilla poster, but for one of the Destoroyah ones, they spell his name wrong. You can also watch more Godzilla clips here, many of which you can't even edit in the Movie Maker, but I'm not really going to show much here, especially since we know how Toei could get with showing movie footage. But I'm not going to show much here, especially since we know how Toho could get with showing movie footage. Next is the museum, where you can look at pretty much every monster from the Godzilla franchise in the form of these weird rainbow holograms. The descriptions for each monster are actually pretty detailed, which is nice, and you can also look at a bunch of pictures of them from their various film appearances, as well as listen to the sounds they make. This is probably the only Godzilla game where you can hear Gabara's iconic roar, so soak it up now while you can. But now that we're done with the tour, let's actually make a movie. So once I finally sat down to play the real meat of this game, I actually started to become very disappointed very quickly. I thought I'd just be able to splice together any clip I want in any order I want, but instead you only have a selection of 3 clips to choose from per scene, and you can only choose clips from one movie that you select. So I can't take footage from Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla and combine it with footage from Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla to make it look like Mogera and Mechagodzilla are fighting. I can only use the limited amount of footage that they provide, and in chronological order. So what's even the point if I can't mix and match the scenes I want to create my own narrative? So all I can really do here is just create a highlight reel of different Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla scenes. Well, they say limitation breeds creativity, so I tried to cut out Space Godzilla from as many clips as possible to just make this movie Godzilla vs. Mogera. Then once I finished, I made a poster for the movie, which is even more limiting because you can only put 3 monsters on the poster, one of which of course is Godzilla, but the other 2 monsters have never appeared in a movie before. So on my poster I can't use Space Godzilla, Mechagodzilla, or even Mothra. So I'm not even really making a poster for my movie, I'm just making a random movie poster for a Godzilla film that doesn't exist. Though you may recognize one of the 2 monsters here, because one of them is Bagon from Super Godzilla on NES. I mentioned in that review that he's a kaiju they designed with the intention of him fighting Godzilla in a movie, but it just never worked out. But the other monster has a very similar story, but this one looks like an alien squid monster, and his name is Douglas? Oh, I'm sorry, Dogolas. So much like the movie maker, the poster maker is extremely limiting. There's barely any monster art to choose from, you can't make your own title, and there's very few backgrounds, and for some reason, some of them look like a 70s psychedelic trip. But I guess this is also noteworthy for being Bagan and Douglas's first, somewhat live-action appearance in official Godzilla media. But to finish off our movie, let's now add sound effects. Oh wait, I guess I'm not adding sound effects to my movie, but I'm just adding random sound effects to other Godzilla scenes. It is kind of amusing to add sound effects to this scene in real time, but I wish they had more humorous sound effects to choose from. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention is that when you're in the Movie Maker, you can also view these behind-the-scenes clips from other Godzilla films, which is actually really cool, but they add this short, looping stock sound effect of people working, and it got really annoying really quickly. So anyway, what more can I even say about this game? It's not even really a game at all, but even as a basic movie studio software, it's extremely bare bones. The thing here that gave me the most amount of enjoyment was looking through all the different characters in the museum, which I guess says a lot about this game. But still, I could have just done that on Wikizilla too, and not have wasted my time. So anyway, to close this one out, let's take a look at the movie I made. after that last one, I'm relieved to play a real game this time. This one is called Godzilla Generations, and it was released on the Sega Dreamcast in 1998 for Japan. I didn't know much about this game going in, but I knew it was one of the few Godzilla games to get a direct sequel, and if this game was good enough to get a sequel, then maybe this is a hidden gem after all. I mean, this is the first fully 3D Godzilla game we've looked at, not counting Movie Studio Tour, and it's even got the iconic score from the films. The gameplay for this one is pretty simple. You can select a few monsters to play as, while you freely walk around the city, stomp on tanks, destroy buildings, and fire your atomic breath. At first glance, this seems to be the Godzilla simulator fans have always wanted. Thanks to the power of the Sega Dreamcast, city destruction has never felt more satisfying. When you hit a building, it'll actually break in the spot you hit it instead of just all crumbling at once. But you can also destroy buildings by just walking into them. The same applies to military vehicles, because they explode as soon as you touch them. But despite how weak they are compared to you, Godzilla will still scream in pain every time he gets hit by one of their missiles. This gets really annoying because I'm just trying to play the damn game, but every 5 seconds Godzilla will get hit by a projectile I can't avoid, and he'll have to stop to scream in pain. But what's also really annoying is the camera. They try to make this cinematic, I guess, almost like you were playing a Godzilla movie, so the camera will constantly change angles to show different shots. It's kind of like the cinematic camera in GTA, except in this game, it's permanent, and more often than not, the camera will move into a really inconvenient spot that makes it really hard to see what you're doing. And at worst, it'll even disorient you because it'll completely change angles and you'll have no idea where you even are. The first few minutes I was playing this game, I was actually having a lot of fun just mindlessly destroying stuff, but not only did the camera get really annoying very quickly, but the gameplay is also extremely repetitive. I mean, sure, destroying buildings as a giant monster is fun at first, but that's pretty much all you're doing in this game, and you have to destroy everything. And I mean everything, even down to the trees. Though you don't have to destroy any military vehicles, and there's no monsters to fight. Although I assume when I took out the Super X, it gave me bonus points, so I guess it's all just for getting a high score. Even the city destruction, which is the main objective of the game, is just to get a high score, because you don't even need to get 100% destruction in order to beat a level. I didn't really know what the criteria is. I just destroyed as many things as I could, but it would only take me a few minutes to get close to 100. And these levels are timed too, so I'd usually spend most of the time limit just walking around aimlessly for several minutes trying to find the one thing I didn't destroy to bring the destruction level from 99 to 100. The maps aren't that big though, but Godzilla moves extremely slowly, but despite all the time they give me, I still couldn't get the destruction to 100% in any level. It would probably be a lot easier if the camera wasn't so annoying. It was probably just one tree that I missed. Though speaking of which, I don't know why the trees explode when you step on them. But the time limit doesn't matter either, because once the time limit's up, you just win the level. So I guess the only way to lose is if you get killed. But you really have to try to get killed, because you can regenerate health just by pressing the roar button. I wasn't even really trying, and I never died in any of these levels, so at one point I just walked out of bounds just to see what would happen. You know a game is good when I'm actively trying to kill myself out of boredom. Maybe it would be a little bit better if there were actually monsters to fight against, but since all you're doing is just destroying buildings, it makes this whole game kind of feel like a tech demo. I mean, graphically, the game looks a lot worse than pretty much every other Dreamcast game released in the same year, so I feel like they were mostly just using this to test out the engine and the destruction physics, since that's pretty much the only mildly impressive thing about this game. Well, like I said before, there are other monsters to play as, but at the start, all you have is Godzilla and Mechagodzilla, and to unlock a new character, you have to beat the entire game as Godzilla. Then once you do that, you unlock a new character, but then you have to beat the story again as that character you just unlocked in order to get the next character. Then you just rinse and repeat that until you get every character. The game has 6 playable characters, but since you get 2 of them at the start, you have to unlock 4 of them, and the game has 11 levels, which means you're gonna have to play 44 levels of just the same shit over and over in order to unlock every character. I tapped out before I even managed to unlock one character, and I'm definitely not going to unlock all of them, though I would be lying if I said that some of these characters didn't look fun to play as. The first one you unlock is the 1954 Godzilla. I mean, that's cool, but it's basically just a reskin of the Godzilla you normally play as. But after him, you unlock Zilla, also known in this game as Godzilla USA. He isn't nearly as slow as the other Godzillas, and he can even run, which makes him seem like he'd actually be one of the more fun characters to play as. But then after you beat the game as him, you unlock Manila. So I guess that's why it's called Godzilla Generations, because most of the characters you play as are different Godzillas from different generations. I mean, there's the current Godzilla, the robot Godzilla, the OG, his inbred American cousin, and his son. And even though I don't really like him, it is funny that you can play as him, especially since he's not really playable in most Godzilla games. I won't deny how hilarious it is to see Manila waddling around and destroying shit while goofy music plays in the background. So at least this game seems to have a sense of humor. But speaking of which, I didn't mention the last character you unlock in this game, and it's not even a kaiju at all. Once you beat the game as Manila, the last character you unlock is Dr. Serizawa from the first Godzilla movie. And no, he's not human-sized, he's actually kaiju-sized. I guess the Oxygen Destroyer didn't kill him after all, it just mutated him into a giant. He's even holding the Oxygen Destroyer the entire time, though for some reason when you use it to attack, it emits lightning bolts. I mean, maybe this isn't even the real Serizawa at all. Maybe it's just a giant robot. That would explain the lightning and the laser that comes out of his eye patch. Or maybe the radiation from Godzilla and the Oxygen Destroyer turned him into a Hulk-like creature, which is why he's taking out his anger on the Japanese people. Or maybe the third option is that God sent him down from the heavens to get his revenge on the people who didn't respect his dying wishes, since his healing animation seems to be him being surrounded by a heavenly light while he's praying. I'm gonna be honest, this character's inclusion alone gives this game some points in its favor, but still, it's not enough for me to recommend anyone actually check it out. So even though I have been shitting on the gameplay a lot in this one, there is a whole nother game mode that I haven't even talked about yet. Since this game was a launch title for the Dreamcast, it makes use of the VMU feature, and in them you can collect these little chibi versions of Toho Kaiju. Then when you connect them to the game, you can have them battle each other, basically like Pokemon Stadium, but for Godzilla. And for those of you that don't know, VMUs are like memory cards that plug into the Dreamcast's controller, but they have little controls and screens on them, so you can actually play little games on them, sort of like a Tamagotchi. They even made Godzilla-themed VMUs for this game. There's a ton of kaiju in this game, and I gotta be honest, their cute chibi designs are actually quite appealing. I just can't play it because it's all in Japanese, and I don't own this game, so I can't make use of the VMU features. But even if this game mode was really good, I still don't think it would be enough to make me actually recommend this game. Though I'm surprised they didn't just turn this into its own game. It probably would have done really well in Japan. Oh, and one other thing I forgot to mention is that you can also watch trailers for other Godzilla movies. I ended up watching this really shitty trailer for King Kong vs. Godzilla, and it was actually a lot more entertaining than playing the game. So despite a few oddities, like Dr. Serizawa and this Pokemon Chow Garden thing, I still don't think this game is worth checking out. But like I said earlier, this game really does feel like a tech demo, so that makes me hope that in the sequel, they flesh out and improve on the things that actually do work about this game. With a subtitle like Maximum Impact, how could this game be bad? Well, this game only came out a year after the first Godzilla generations, and although that sounds like not a lot of time, that wasn't unheard of for sequels back then, especially if they were mostly using the same framework and engine. Though the curious thing about this game is that it uses a completely different engine. Not only that, but the gameplay is completely different too. I was hoping this game would improve on a lot of the things I didn't like about the previous one, like adding more characters, have a better camera, less tanky controls, more level variety, more combat options, and more enemies. Well, it turns out they're basically doing none of those things, well, besides having a better camera. But that's mainly because the camera is locked to one position, because this game is actually an on-rail shooter. Once the game started, I thought something was wrong with my controller, because Godzilla just kept moving forward on his own, but that's completely intentional. It's sort of like Panzer Dragoon, except you can't fly. You can move left to right though, and even bring him to a complete stop for a bit, but ultimately your goal is just to keep moving forward while causing as much destruction as possible. I guess that's the one thing that makes this similar to the first Godzilla generations, but the only attack you can do here is your atomic breath, although you can duck, and the roar button is back, but in this game it doesn't heal you, so you actually have to be careful about taking too much damage in this one. So in this game your movement is much more limited, you only have one character to play as, and they didn't even keep the cool building destruction physics from the previous game. Based on all that, you'd think this sequel would be a huge downgrade from the previous. I mean, they don't even have the classic music anymore, but I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, even though this is a completely different game, I think it's pretty much better in almost every single way. Even though you only play as Godzilla, and you only attack with your atomic breath, destroying stuff with it in this game is pretty satisfying. And it doesn't really get old like it did in the previous game. You can hold it down to charge its power, and while you do, you can lock onto enemies, so when you're done charging, he'll shoot at all those targets automatically. And it feels great to lock onto a bunch of targets and watch Godzilla take them all out at once, especially since a lot of buildings will inevitably get destroyed in the process. Besides the gameplay being more fun, I think the main thing they improved from the previous game was having much better graphics, although the model they used for Godzilla does look a bit wonky, and when you pause the game you even get a 360 view of him, and that really gives you a sense of how strange he really looks from all angles. Though I guess that's not the only improvement, because there's actually boss monsters to fight against in this game, and unlike Godzilla, they all look great. Even though the gameplay during regular stages can feel a bit repetitive sometimes, they still go out of their way to make each boss fight feel distinct from each other. And speaking of distinct, check out Mechagodzilla and Mogera. They each have their own unique designs in this game that I've never seen before, and they actually look pretty sick. But after you defeat both of those bosses, it's on to Space Godzilla, and that was probably the most annoying stage in the whole game. Because before you actually fight him, you have to go through this stage where there's all these crystal projectiles flying at you from every direction, and they're impossible to see, let alone dodge. At least this game is generous with how many lives it gives you, although as you would imagine it greatly affects your score, because I died quite a lot in this game, because taking damage is almost unavoidable in many cases. But even though this game can be frustrating, it's also really short. That's mostly because of how arcadey it is. You can beat it in about an hour if you really knew what you were doing. Though your only reward for beating the game is that you can take a look at all the models. Also, I didn't mention this before, because I think it goes without saying, but this game doesn't have the same Pokemon type game that the previous one had. I mean, to be honest, I don't even know why this game is called Godzilla Generations at all. This game has almost nothing to do with the first game. They're completely different genres. But I would still recommend you check this one out. Although it is short and simple, I think that's to its benefit. And even though it only released in Japan, it's completely accessible to someone who speaks English. I've seen a lot of people online shit-talk this game, and I think that's mostly because it has the name Godzilla Generations, so they expect it to be like the previous game, when it's nothing like it at all. And although this certainly isn't a masterpiece, it absolutely is the superior game. Now that we're talking about this game, I feel like it's the start of a new era. And I'm not just saying that because we're also in the beginning of the Millennium era. During the Heisei era, Toho was trying to move Godzilla away from the stigma of being a cheap, cheesy B-movie monster for children, and it said they wanted to make the movies more gritty and serious. Although many fans consider the movies made during this era to be some of the best in the franchise, box office-wise, they just weren't doing the numbers Toho wanted. But because of that, they were also working with Hollywood to get a big-budget American Godzilla movie to be made. And at the end of the Heisei era, Toho decided to put the character on ice for a while. So because of that, we got the TriStar Godzilla movie in 1998. Toho was hoping that by turning Godzilla into a big Hollywood blockbuster, it would reinvigorate the franchise and bring legitimacy back to the character. But instead, it turned into a movie that critics, fans, and casual moviegoers all hated. So even though at the end of the Heisei era, they killed off Godzilla and planned on keeping it that way for a long time, after the reception of TriStar's Godzilla, they decided to bring him back. And this is what kicked off the beginning of the Millennium era, even though Japan was still technically in the Heisei era. They weren't just making new films though, they wanted to strengthen the brand in the way that the American Godzilla movie couldn't. And they started by being more strict with the licensing so that more poorly made products wouldn't be made featuring the characters. This wasn't just to avoid another Zilla situation, because when it came to video games, in the past they would release multiple Godzilla games almost every single year, but pretty much all of them were shovelware. But ever since the early 2000s, now that they're being more strict about it, you're lucky to even get one game every few years. At first, this was a good thing though, because it meant they were more concerned with quality over quantity. And some of the games that came out during this era are considered some of the best Godzilla games ever made. And the game that kicked off this new era of Godzilla games was Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee, not to be confused with the movie Destroy All Monsters. This game released on the GameCube and Xbox in 2000, but strangely it was never released on the PS2. So even though I gave this game a long preamble, I think it deserves it, because this didn't just create a whole new era of Godzilla games, but a whole new franchise. Many people call this game and its two sequels the Pipeworks Trilogy, because that's the name of the studio that made these games. And whether you love them or hate them, they're undeniably the most influential Godzilla games ever made. I am a bit biased though, because this game does have a ton of nostalgia for me, but it doesn't make that statement any less true. I haven't played this game in many years, but I used to play it all the time at my friend's house when I was younger, and this game was my introduction to Godzilla as a whole. I mean, I knew what Godzilla was before playing this game, but my only real exposure to the franchise prior to this game was the 1998 American movie. So this game is important to me, because if I never played it, I may have never even became a Godzilla fan, which means I would have never even made this video. But anyway, let's finally talk about the game itself. Although of all the games that we'll look at in this video, this is probably the one that the most people watching have played before. We've looked at a few Godzilla fighting games before, but this is the first 3D fighting game we've seen today, and it's the first game on our list to allow 4 players to play at once. One of the most distinctive things about this game is how it opts to use a more overhead sort of camera, almost like you're a news helicopter watching the monsters fight from above. It does fuck with your sense of scale a bit, but playing in a stage while standing next to tall buildings and small vehicles does help though. If you're playing this game on GameCube in America, it only has 11 playable characters, because they removed Kiryu from the roster. I guess because that movie wasn't out yet in America, but he's in the Japanese version, and they ended up adding him to the Xbox port when that dropped a year later. Plus that port added new stages too, one of which is my favorite stage in the whole game, which is the boxing ring. So for those reasons alone, I'd say the Xbox version is far superior, but they also made it so you could play the melee mode with the enemy AI, because in the GameCube version, you can only select that mode if you had 3 or 4 friends to play with. But since I don't have anyone to play with, the Xbox version was pretty much essential for me. There are other improvements in this port too, like the graphics and frame rate are a bit better, but there's also DLC stages that you can no longer download. But anyway, let's go back to talking about the roster, because at first glance, it seems pretty bare bones. You only start off with 4 characters, but thanks to cheat codes, I unlocked everything from the start. But once you do unlock every character, you may be disappointed to find out that there's no Mothra or Space Godzilla, but the former still does appear in the game, albeit as a stage hazard that flies around and attacks enemies once you grab a specific item. It's also weird that there's no Megaguirus or Baragon, since they appeared in movies very recently before this game came out. Though supposedly Baragon was supposed to be in the game's final roster, but was cut for time. But Mothra isn't the only stage hazard, because Hedorah appears as well to attack the player who's done the most damage to the city. Now when it comes to the gameplay itself, it's one of those games that seems very simple if you're just casually picking it up to play, but it actually has a surprising amount of depth, much like Smash Brothers. Okay, maybe not that deep. You got your basic attacks, your punches, your kicks. You can also jump, crouch, grab, and block, but every monster also has a special move and a beam attack. I like that they gave each monster their own variation of the beam attack, and also kept it separate from the special attacks, cause some special moves can be as simple as Godzilla attacking with his tail, and others are kind of OP, like Megalon could drill underground, and Rodan could fly really fast, which makes him really annoying to fight against. Plus the robot characters like Mechagodzilla and Mecha King Ghidorah can shoot missiles, and they even have some resistance to hit stun. But the meta of this game pretty much relies on beam attacks, cause they're easy to spam and virtually unblockable. Plus you can aim your beam attack by moving the C-stick around, which makes it easier to hit multiple targets. If I'm being honest, this game is actually really unbalanced, but it's not really a problem for me because it's not meant to be a competitive game at all. It's not really something you'd see at tournaments, although I'm sure they do have tournaments where people play this game. It's just meant to be a party game you turn on with a bunch of friends on a couch to have fun. I mean, pretty much the best thing about this game is that the developers definitely understood that they didn't need to take a game like this seriously. I mean, they weren't trying to make the greatest fighting game in the world, which is evident by the simple controls and lack of combos. They just wanted to make a fun game, and it seemed they had fun making it too, because it shows in the final product. I mean, the story of this game is something taken right out of a sci-fi B-movie or a Showa-era Godzilla film. The plot is that a race of aliens called the Vortak have taken control of all monsters, well except for the one that you choose to play as, because you have to fight against the ones that the aliens control. I mean, it's just a typical arcade mode. You're just fighting each monster one by one, but there are a few cutscenes. It's good that the game doesn't take itself too seriously. The monsters aren't all slow and lumbering. They move pretty quickly and with human-like animations. It reflects the Showa-era guy in rubber suit aesthetic. There's even a fun thing you can do where if you step on your enemy's toes, it causes them to do this funny hurt animation. In the beginning I mentioned that this game has cheat codes, and there are quite a lot of them. I was hoping the tiny mode would be more funny, but it only makes them a little bit smaller. But it kind of fucks with the hitboxes so that when you shoot your atomic breath, they aim above the character. There's also cheat codes that'll make it so Hedorah will appear every single time you play, and also ones that'll disable the military. I kinda wish this was a game setting though, because sometimes they can get annoying. They have this freeze beam, and sometimes in the middle of a battle, they would just freeze me dead in my tracks. Most of the time it was when I was in the middle of charging my atomic breath about to kill my enemy. So here's the last thing I'll say about this game. Even though some aspects of it don't hold up as well as I'd like, and it is very simplistic, I think this game has a ton of charm, and it is a lot of fun with a group of friends. So I don't think I'm blinded by nostalgia when I say I highly recommend checking this out. That is, if, for whatever reason, you haven't already. Godzilla Domination released in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance, the same year as Destroy All Monsters Melee, because back then it was very common for big video game releases to get handheld ports that were sort of like companion pieces for all the people that either didn't have home consoles, or they just hoped that people would double dip and buy both the handheld and home console versions. These handheld ports are infamous for usually being shovelware that are inferior to the home console releases, and I expected no different when I played this one. But when I did play this game for the first time, I was pleasantly surprised when I found out the game actually translates the 3D 4-player monster battles from the original game much better than I could have ever imagined on Game Boy. I mean, it's not perfect. As you would imagine, the mechanics are way simpler, but this game has a very unique style that helps it stand out from the original. I just love the way the characters look in this game. Even though I typically don't like when Western media depicts Godzilla as green, I think it works here with the cartoony art style. This game also has its own single-player story mode. It shows this reporter girl reporting on what's going on with the monsters, which in this case involves a meteor crash landing on Earth, which causes all the monsters to go crazy and start fighting each other. So throughout the single player, you'll just be fighting the other monsters, sometimes in 1v1 battles, sometimes 2v2, and sometimes even 1v3 battles. Those fights can get pretty irritating though, since you'll often get ganged up on by the other 3 monsters. Also, sometimes between levels, you'll have to play these bonus games to increase your score, but I also found these pretty annoying too. These levels are sort of like if Galaga had a baby with this game, and it just doesn't work at all. But then once you fight your way through the gauntlet, you have to face the game's final boss, a giant Mecha King Ghidorah. This boss was pretty hard, but it was the kind of challenge that's enjoyable rather than annoying, especially since I learned how to cheese the enemies during regular fights, which made fighting them extremely easy. The gameplay is very similar to Destroy All Monsters Melee. You can duck, block, jump, pick up enemies and buildings, but since it's on Game Boy, you only have 2 attack buttons. But if you hold down the attack buttons, you can charge your attacks, and once fully charged, they deal a ton of damage. You can even charge while moving around, so even though each monster has their own special abilities, I found that the meta was to just keep abusing my charge attacks, especially if you can get them in a corner. My biggest critique of this game though is that they use way too many stock sound effects, though I guess another critique is how small the roster is. I mean, I get it's on Game Boy, but I could have done with at least 2 more characters, like Anguirus or Gigan. Though at least you can actually play as Mothra in this game, unlike Destroy All Monsters Melee. There aren't that many stages either, but the selection is actually quite varied. And some stages even have their own gimmicks, like the space stage has low gravity, and the ice stage is all slippery, although that one is a lot more annoying than anything. But besides some nitpicks, I would actually say this game is a hidden gem. Although it's not better than Destroy All Monsters, the fact that it can even hold a candle to it on Game Boy says a lot about it. So if you're a fan of any of the Pipeworks Godzilla games, definitely check this one out. Whenever people talk about the best Godzilla games, they usually default to Destroy All Monsters Melee, and although I just sung its praises, I think it's a shame that comparatively, not that many people talk about its sequel, Godzilla Save the Earth, although at least in recent years, that's been starting to change. It released in 2004 for the Xbox and PS2, so this time around we actually got a PS2 port, but no GameCube port. But this isn't just a sequel to Destroy All Monsters Melee, because the game's launch coincided with the release of Godzilla Final Wars, and much like how that movie was meant to be the ultimate Godzilla film, this game was trying to be the ultimate Godzilla video game. First off, this game has way more characters than the first one. We got Mothra, Baragon, Space Godzilla, Bogera, and even Jet Jaguar, who's my personal favorite in this game, and a lot of these new characters have gimmicks that make them feel more unique. Like Mogera can only charge energy by either blocking attacks or shutting down completely, which leaves you extremely vulnerable in fights. And Space Godzilla needs to erect these crystals all over the map in order to charge his energy. Though if you pick Mothra, you have to start out as the larval form, but you can metamorphosize whenever you want, and at least once you do, you regain all your health. But one of the reasons why Jet Jaguar is my favorite is because he can use his energy to shrink and grow. Of course, new characters weren't the only thing this game added. There's also new stages, new modes, and new unlockables. In the first game, you can only unlock stuff by beating the arcade mode as a certain monster, but now you just get money and you can use that to buy whatever you want in the shop. And you're not just buying new characters and stages, because there's also some pretty cool concept art you can buy too. As for the new game modes though, they're mostly just minigames. There's one where you play basketball with these weird energy things, and it's pretty fun actually. Then there's stuff like Monster Roundup, where you have to throw other monsters into a fence, Monster Bowling, which is self-explanatory, and a mode where you just have to destroy as many buildings as you can. There's also a single-player one, where you're just shooting your atomic breath at military vehicles that are passing by, and this one's actually kind of annoying. There are some more that I haven't mentioned too, and some of them can be hit or miss. They just throw them into the story mode occasionally, so you're not just fighting monsters the whole time. As far as the core gameplay though, it's pretty much the same, though of course they did make some improvements over the previous game. Grabbing and throwing objects isn't as janky, beams are less spammable, and you can't get beaten down as much while you're on the ground. But the best addition to the combat is that now you can actually do beam clashes. Although that is a cool addition, I never actually figured out how to win a beam struggle. It's not as easy as just mashing the buttons. You have to press a specific button at the right time, but it's pretty difficult to do during a fight. There are some nice quality of life changes too, like showing each character's strength and weaknesses. Like some characters are resistant to electricity attacks, some characters are resistant to fire, etc. The story is more of the same. You're fighting the Vortak like in the first game, but they're much more of a threat, and their leader is a female this time around. I mean, I guess that's pretty much it. I'm surprised by how little I have to say about this game. I guess that's cause most of the things I have to say about the gameplay I already talked about in my Destroy All Monsters Melee review. I mean, this game is pretty much the same, just with a lot more content and some improvements. And for those exact reasons, I think this is by far the superior game. I mean, if you like Destroy All Monsters Melee, you're definitely going to love this one even more. It's one of those video game sequels that's so good, it pretty much invalidates the first one. Not that Destroy All Monsters Melee is bad or anything, it's still a fun time. This game just takes everything that worked about that game and improves it. It's a great time whether you're by yourself or with friends, and I think it's the best Godzilla game we've looked at so far. before we talk about the final game in the Pipeworks trilogy, let's talk about the handheld version first, since this actually released before the Wii version. The Wii version of Godzilla Unleashed came out on December 5th, 2007, and the PS2 port released November 20th, which is the same day as this DS port. Although I keep calling this game a port, it actually isn't. Even though both games have the title Godzilla Unleashed, this game is more like a handheld companion piece, much like Godzilla Domination was to Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee. But because I enjoyed playing Godzilla Domination so much, I actually had very high hopes for this one. Although this one isn't a fighting game, they still tried to carry over that cartoony art style. But the art in this game is way more stylized than Godzilla Domination, and I actually kinda dig it. Though once I started the game, I pretty much immediately got confused, because I selected Godzilla at first to get a feel for the game, but then I had to select a second character, and I could only pick from the top row. You only start off with 4 characters, and they're each grouped by the ones who can fly and the ones who can't. So I had to select one ground type, which was either Godzilla or Megalon, and one flying type, which is either Mothra or Batra. And since I already selected Godzilla, I decided to make Mothra my companion. At first I thought the second character I was picking was the character I was going to fight against, but you actually get to play as 2 characters, which I guess why it's called Double Smash. Plus its initials are the same as the Nintendo DS. You also have to fight against 2 opponents as well, and for this level it's Ebirah and Titanosaurus. At least Ebirah gets some love in this game, unlike all the other ones. I know I just praised this game's art style before, but it only really works in a 2D setting, and unlike Godzilla Domination, this game opts for 3D polygons, and that heavily stylized, cartoony art style does not translate nearly as well to a low-poly video game. So the gameplay is basically a 2D auto-scroller, and all I'm doing is punching and kicking jets and boats as they constantly come at me, while the screen keeps scrolling to the right. And since this game was made for DS, it utilizes both screens, but as Godzilla, I'm just confined to the bottom. But luckily you can jump extremely high, which lets you reach the top screen. Plus if you spam attacks while in midair, you can basically hover, but you can switch to your teammate whenever you want. And when you play as Mothra, she can just fly around. Plus she has more ranged attacks. So in a game like this, there's pretty much no reason not to play as the flying character. If there's ever a point where I'm not playing as Mothra, it's probably because I was killed, because in this game it's pretty much impossible to avoid taking damage from all the things flying at you. And what makes it even harder is the fact that the controls in this game feel extremely awkward. It's the kind of bad controls that's really difficult to describe, but at least when you die you don't just lose, you just switch to your partner. And while you're switched, your dead teammate will slowly heal automatically, so it's good that Mothra isn't down for the count. But when I play as Mothra, since she could fly and shoot webs, it feels more like a 2D shoot-'em-up. She does have melee attacks too, but they're pretty much useless. Of course, Godzilla has a range attack too, since he could use his atomic breath, but you're pretty vulnerable while charging it, and you're bound to get hit by attacks. But it does way more damage than Mothra's attacks, so I just use Godzilla during boss fights. But before you get to the boss, pretty much all you're doing is punching and shooting at jets for like 5 minutes. There's barely any enemy variety, and dying is almost impossible since you can heal while you're switched as your partner. And the only other obstacles besides the enemies are these structures that block your path at least once or twice per level. But in order to get rid of them, you don't just simply attack them, you have to do these button sequences, and if your timing isn't 100% perfect, you'll have to start again. I think it's possible that the emulator I use was causing this issue, since when I watch other people play this part, they don't have nearly as much trouble as I'm having. But still, it wouldn't make it any less annoying that they have these obstacles here that I can only destroy by doing this 30-second button combo. Plus, these are the only parts in the whole game where you can actually destroy buildings, though you're supposed to get a reward for destroying them, like health or even a few seconds of invulnerability. But since I always failed, I never got any of those. Much like Godzilla on NES, once I got to the end of a screen in a side-scrolling part, I thought I was done, but then it would just reward me with more side-scrolling. Except the levels in this game are somehow even longer and more tedious. It felt like forever before I finally got to the first boss, but once I did, I was somewhat relieved to actually fight against another monster, and in this case it was Titanosaurus. I thought I would have to fight both him and Ebirah, but I'm just fighting them one at a time. So because of that, since I have 2 characters and they could each heal, this boss fight was a breeze. Though I say that because it was easy, not because it was quick. Because it was annoying trying to hit him because he was jumping all over the place and I could only face one direction, so sometimes he would jump behind me and hit me and I couldn't hit him back. Plus the hit detection in this game is god-awful, so sometimes my attacks would just go right through him. Or I would hit him and he would just hit me right back. But the boss still would have taken a long time even if he wasn't jumping all over the place, because even a fully charged atomic breath did barely any damage to him. So now the bad hit detection is made even worse by the fact that he's a damage sponge. This made me not even want to complete the level, because after so many minutes of side-scrolling and then fighting the boss, I have to do it all over again to fight Ebirah. I just skimmed through a YouTube video to see the rest of the bosses, and once again this is another game where you fight against a giant Mecha King Ghidorah. I will admit though, there are some neat picks like Manda, the Gotengo, and even a completely original monster, though this boss is just a giant sphinx, so not exactly an inspired kaiju design. I will admit though, some of these bosses do look a little bit better than the one I played, but this game was just so bad I couldn't keep playing. I didn't want to have to trudge through several hours of horrible side-scrolling, tedious bosses, and god-awful controls. Even if you like Godzilla Unleashed, this game has almost nothing to do with that game, and I wouldn't recommend you play it at all. Godzilla Unleashed is the final game in the Pipeworks trilogy, and it released on the Wii and PS2 in 2007. Although, as I mentioned earlier, the Wii version came out a few weeks after the PS2 version, so this time around it's the Xbox that gets left behind. So I guess there's some sort of rule preventing them from releasing these games on Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo consoles at the same time. As you would expect, this game adds many new characters to play as. You can now play as the Titanosaurus, King Caesar, and even Varan. Plus they even managed to squeeze in the highly requested Biolante. I mean, look at how huge this motherfucker is. Truly the Ridley of this game. There are also two completely original characters, Obsidius and Crystalak. Crystalak looks kinda cool. It kinda reminds me of Shimo, but Obsidius is nothing special. But it turns out, they actually designed a bunch of original monsters for this game, and they held a vote to see which ones fans wanted the most. But of course Obsidius ended up winning, and this just makes me dislike him even more. I mean, I don't know why the fans picked him, because of all these monsters, I think he looks the lamest. Plus it is weird that they filled up not one, but two character slots for original monsters instead of adding in more fan favorites. Like Hedorah and Monster X still haven't been playable in any of these games. But the original characters also function as part of the game's story mode, because yes, there is an actual story here, with cutscenes. Well, sort of. Every cutscene in this game is just a still image with bad voice acting. Even the intro movie is just footage from the game. There's not a single pre-rendered cutscene in this entire game. It ends up making this game feel a lot cheaper than the previous two, which is weird because this is the one where they decided to actually have a fully fleshed out story. Even though those first two games had very limited cutscenes, they at least looked like they had some budget behind it. But does the gameplay at least feel improved? Well, let's keep talking about the story mode first. Of course, you still got your monster fights, but here they actually have much more level variety. And I don't just mean occasional minigames like in the previous game. In the first level, you're walking around Monster Island, destroying buildings, and you gotta save Anguirus from these crystal things. I assume that has something to do with Crystalak, but I was too distracted by the shitty cutscenes to actually pay attention to the story. And in the next level, you have to destroy these crystal towers. But there's 3 of them, and they each have a ton of health, and they're constantly shooting at you and pushing you away, which is really annoying. I mean, I guess I can appreciate the ambition with this game's story mode. In these parts of the campaign, it has this over-the-shoulder third-person camera, and it makes it feel more like an action game than a fighting game. But these levels are just so boring. I do like when fighting games have single-player modes with more meat on them, like Street Fighter 6, but in this game, every time I was playing one of these levels, it just made me wish I was playing a monster fight instead. And that's saying a lot because I really don't like the combat in this game. I guess that means now we have to address the biggest problem with this game, and that's that they decided to develop it for the Wii. Since the Wii was the hot new console at the time, motion controls were all the rage, so naturally they added motion controls to this game too. It's a problem that plagued many Wii games, and although people thought it was a neat novelty at the time, nowadays people are sick of forced motion controls. There are other fighting games on the Wii that allow you to use a GameCube controller if you don't want to use the motion controls, but this game doesn't have that option. You can only use the Wiimote and Nunchuck to play. Well, you could instead play the PS2 version, since that you can just use the DualShock to play, but that game is also missing a ton of characters from the Wii version. There's no 1954 Godzilla, no Showa-era Mechagodzilla, no Varan, no King Caesar, but I guess as an apology, they added Batra. Plus, they also added a skin for Gigan, where you can use his Showa-era design, because in the Wii version, it only uses his Final Wars design. Although the gesture is nice, Batra is just a clone of Mothra, and Gigan is just a skin, so it doesn't really make up for the lack of characters, nor does it make up for how badly the PS2 version looks and runs. So I guess when it comes down to the decision to either play the PS2 version with way less characters, worse frame rate, and worse graphics, I think the choice is obvious that the Wii version is the definitive version, even though it has forced motion controls. So in order to play, you have to swing the Wiimote up and down and side to side while pressing the attack button at the same time in order to do specific moves. Then if you want to grab an enemy, you have to swing both the Wiimote and the Nunchuck down at the same time. But more often than not, I would just end up jumping instead, because swinging the Nunchuck also makes you jump. Plus a lot of times when I actually managed to pull off a grab, I would end up grabbing a building that was next to my enemy instead. I just don't think the Wii is responsive enough to handle this kind of combat. They had to slow down the game significantly in order to make it work. So now every time you pull off an attack, it just ends up feeling sluggish. Even if you're a pro at this game, you're guaranteed to have a lot of moments where your input either isn't registered or it does the wrong move entirely. Plus now when you try to use your beam attack, you have to aim it with the Wii remote, which feels really awkward to do. And they really heavily nerfed the beam attacks too. Now in order to charge your energy, you have to charge it manually, which takes forever and leaves you wide open for attacks, and if you get interrupted before one of your cells are fully charged, it doesn't count. But even when you do hit an enemy with a fully charged blast, it doesn't knock them back like it used to. They barely even flinch, so they can still easily retaliate against you. Plus, even if you're the type of person that doesn't mind motion controls, they still had to dumb down the combat a lot compared to the previous games in order to make it work. So even if you do play on the PS2, the combat's going to be a significant downgrade from Save the Earth. I mean, besides the roster, pretty much everything about this game is a downgrade from the previous one. I mean, I guess it's leaps and bounds better than Double Smash, but that's not really saying much. Despite being on a more powerful console, the graphics don't look that much better from the previous game, and the stages aren't even that good either. The story mode was unique, and the variety in the roster is the best we've gotten in any Godzilla game so far. But playing this game just made me wish I was playing Save the Earth instead. Ultimately, this game was just a huge disappointment, not just for me, but for millions of Godzilla fans everywhere. Even though many fans and critics bashed Godzilla Unleashed, it still sold pretty well, yet despite that there was a huge drought in Godzilla games after it came out. For the next 7 years, there were no new home console Godzilla games, or even handheld games, just the occasional phone or browser game. But many of those are now lost media. Many people assumed it was because of the poor critical reception of Godzilla Unleashed. The Godzilla franchise as a whole wasn't doing too hot at the time. Godzilla Final Wars was the biggest and most expensive Godzilla movie to date, and it was supposed to be a love letter to the franchise and the fans, yet despite that, both critically and commercially, it didn't do too well. Toho decided it was time to put the franchise on ice once again. So for almost a decade after that movie came out, it was probably one of the worst times to be a Godzilla fan. There were no new movies, no games, not even a TV show. It seemed that people just weren't interested in this franchise anymore. I mean, at this point, even I would have taken another shovelware game. But finally, all that radio silence was about to end, when Toho let Hollywood take yet another crack at making an American Godzilla film. This new Godzilla movie, produced by Legendary Pictures, was meant to right the wrongs of the 1998 Godzilla movie, and the popularity of this film even convinced Toho to start making their own Godzilla movies again. Now that the franchise was reinvigorated again, much like in the Millennium era, they would license out a big-budget video game to coincide with the launch of the new movie. To cap off Godzilla's 60th anniversary, they wanted this to be the definitive Godzilla video game experience. They wanted this game to show fans what it would really feel like to be Godzilla. Not only that, but it would also feature the largest cast of kaiju ever in a Godzilla game. So not only were we getting a new Godzilla game for the first time since I became a Godzilla fan, but it was also supposed to be this big anniversary celebration, at a time where interest in the franchise was the highest it's ever been. I was so excited for this game, I couldn't wait to get my hands on it, but at first I was worried because it seemed like this game was going to be a Japanese exclusive. It came out in Japan for the PS3 on December 18th, 2014, and we didn't get an English release until July 14th, 2015. Though at first it was a PS3 exclusive, when the game released worldwide, it came out on both PS3 and PS4. But in Japan, the PS4 version of the game was called Godzilla vs., whereas in Japan on the PS3, and in America the game is just called Godzilla. Even though I made fun of games before for just being called Godzilla, here I think it works, and I actually prefer the American box art over the original, which is rare for Japanese video games. At the time, I only had a PS3 and no PS4, so when the PS4 version was announced, I held off on buying the game on PS3 because I knew the PS4 version would have improvements. So even though I was really excited for this game, I held off on playing it until I ended up getting my PS4 in 2017. Plus I figured since the game had been out for a couple of years, I could get it for a cheaper price. Well, not only did the game never drop in price, but that very same year it was delisted from all digital stores, which drastically increased the price of physical copies. So now this game is extremely rare, and I was only able to play it many years later after borrowing it from a friend. Plus of course I was made aware of this game's reputation during that time, but I still wanted to try the game out for myself. But now after almost another decade of waiting, I'm finally able to play this game. The game at least starts off promising. You play as Godzilla and everything is black and white like the original 1954 film, and you're just destroying shit while the classic theme plays in the background. Though it's weird that even though this says it takes place 60 years ago, you're playing as the Heisei Godzilla. I mean, even though that's my favorite Godzilla design, I wish they had skins of Godzilla's different designs from his various films. I mean, besides that, this level is about as quintessential Godzilla as you can get. All it's missing is another monster to fight, but we'll get those pretty soon. This level basically acts as a tutorial to get you situated with the controls. And in just the tutorial, it really shows how dedicated they were to making you feel like you were playing a Godzilla film. But because they wanted this to be as accurate of a Godzilla experience as possible, that means he's very slow and lumbering, which makes controlling him extremely tedious, and his attacks are no different. Anytime you do any sort of attack, it feels like there's a huge amount of delay. Plus, as soon as I started playing, I got immediately disappointed by how unsatisfying the destruction is in this game. A lot of buildings require you to hit them multiple times in order for them to break. And even though they seem very dedicated to making Godzilla control as accurately as possible, it would be a lot more realistic if buildings just crumbled as soon as you touched them. And since I mentioned before that Godzilla's attacks are extremely slow, it makes destroying buildings feel more monotonous than fun. And once you do destroy the building, they all blow up in the exact same way. I get they were trying to emulate that classic style of Kaiju Eiga effects where they put explosives in the miniature buildings. But that means every time a building gets destroyed, it'll flash for a sec before exploding. I mean, I appreciate the attention to detail, but it just makes the destruction feel even more unsatisfying when every time a building gets destroyed, there's a delay before it actually breaks. It's kinda sad that Godzilla Generations on Dreamcast got destruction right and this game didn't. But much like that game, pretty much all you're doing in this game is just destroying buildings. I mean, I know there's also kaiju fights in this one too, but that's not the real meat of this game. The main single-player campaign of this game is called God of Destruction mode, and basically all you need to do is destroy generators, and they take a lot of hits. You don't even really need to destroy buildings or the military, but you're inevitably going to on your path to the generators. But even though the generators are your main objective, it is advised that you destroy as much stuff as possible, since the more destruction you cause, the bigger and stronger you get. I actually really like the idea of Godzilla slowly getting bigger and stronger as you level up throughout the game. I mean, I guess that's why they called this God of Destruction mode, but causing as much destruction as you can is easier said than done. Some levels have a time limit, and due to how slow you move and how long it takes to destroy some generators, you actually don't really have much time to go around stomping buildings, especially since you'll need to fight another monster in order to get to the generator. But at least now we actually get to fight another kaiju, because this is the part of the game I was looking forward to the most. I mean, at least graphically, every monster in this game looks fantastic. They're pretty much one-to-one with how they look in the movies, and the sound design for them is great too. But when it comes to the combat, it feels like this game wasn't meant for 1v1 kaiju fights at all. Your attacks are still really slow and lumbering, and there's barely any feedback when you hit your enemy. Though once you do a combo, it'll usually knock the enemy back, but since your animations take so long, by the time you're done with the combo, they'll be able to retaliate and hit you back. So pretty much all you're doing is just trading blows back and forth with no real sense of strategy. It's just mashing buttons, but not in the fun way. I mean, it's not like I'm expecting this game to have crazy combos or anything, but a block button would be nice. Though if you level up enough, you'll be big enough to tank more hits without flinching, but the same goes for the enemy too. I mean, two really big, slow, tanky enemies with barely any hits done fighting against each other doesn't really make for the most exciting combat. Though some enemies are easy to cheese, but a lot of times it's almost impossible to fight against a monster without taking some damage yourself. But that's also because during these fights, the military will be constantly hitting you with a barrage of attacks. They usually don't do a ton of damage, but they'll slowly chip away at your health, and sometimes they'll pull out the big guns, which you'll need to go out of your way to destroy. But the kaiju fights don't appear in every single level, so for the most part, all you'll be doing is slowly stomping around these huge city maps while slowly walking to the generator and slowly attacking it till it explodes, rinse and repeat until the game's over. But sometimes it isn't just one generator, sometimes there's multiple generators, and sometimes those generators have shields, and sometimes they'll be guarded by giant cannons too. This game should have been everything people wanted out of a Godzilla game, but instead this gameplay loop makes everything feel like busy work. I guess what it boils down to is that making a game that accurately shows what it feels like to be a kaiju is just an inherently flawed concept, because these monsters are just way too slow and lumbering. I mean, imagine if the monsters in the Pipeworks games moved as slow as this. I mean, I know they're just trying to be accurate to the movies, but then why are they having me destroy generators over and over? And the worst part is, in order to unlock everything, you need to play the story mode multiple times. The first time I played through the campaign, I didn't get to see the final boss, because you need to get 100% destruction and reach over 100 meters in height. Not only that, but I forgot to mention there's these spots in every single stage where the camera angle will change and you have to stand in the frame while the military scans you and collects data. And you need to find all these data collection points in every single level. But why am I helping the military collect data to defeat Godzilla if I'm playing as Godzilla? So even though I really didn't want to play more of this game, I did a second playthrough where I was more thorough with the destruction and finding all the data collection points. And if you thought the levels were tedious before, trying to actually unlock everything makes this game a nightmare. There's just one level where you're standing in the middle of the ocean, and the level borders are quite small, but all you had to do was destroy a military submarine. It seems simple enough, but you can only do that when it's surfaced, which you would only do for a few seconds before diving back down. So you just have to hope that it appears close to you, because even though this map is so small, you move so slowly that if it spawns on the other side, you won't be able to hit it in time before it goes back down. Then later I had to fight the Super X, which was like trying to swat a fly. I already talked about how bad the monster fights feel in this game, and it's made even worse when I'm trying to fight an enemy that's way smaller than me. I ended up dying at this part, and once you do, you lose a lot of your height, which makes getting to 100 meters even more difficult. So I guess I just have to play this again, but then once I did, I finally got to the final boss. I thought it was going to be Destoroyah or something, but you actually have to fight against Super Mechagodzilla. But then once I beat him and the credits rolled, that's where you get to actually fight the true final boss. After the credits, you turn into Burning Godzilla, and you have to face off against the 2014 Legendary Godzilla. Well, actually, before that, you have to fight the Super X3, and he's just as annoying this time around. I will admit though, seeing these two Godzillas face off against each other is pretty cool, but still, the combat is just as slow and clunky as ever. But now that we're done with God of Destruction mode, let's see what else this game has to offer. I said before that I borrowed this game from a friend. Well, the whole reason he bought this game was so that we could play together in versus mode, and I was actually excited for this because I figured playing against a friend would make the combat a bit more fun. But once we tried playing it, we realized that there is no local multiplayer in this game at all. You can fight other players though, but you can only do it online. But since this game is delisted, you can obviously no longer do that. I can't even fight against the CPU to try out the other characters I unlocked. So you're telling me they made a game called Godzilla Vs, give it a huge roster of monsters, and they don't even let you fight as them with a friend in the same room. Though I guess I should be grateful that I couldn't play online, because I wouldn't want to be subjected to having to fight against another player who has hundreds of hours in this game. So if you just came here for the monster battles, your only real option is the King of Kaiju mode. It's essentially just an arcade mode where you have to fight through a gauntlet of various monsters from this game's roster. And considering all I've said about this game's combat, it's no surprise I didn't care for this mode. Though one game mode that I did enjoy, at least more than the others, is Evolution mode. But when you destroy certain structures or defeat enemies, you unlock new moves that you can equip to your character. Some of these are pretty amusing too, like they have Godzilla's Victory Dance, or that Atomic Breath flying move he did in Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Plus all these new moves and upgrades you unlock can be used in versus mode as well. And even though I did enjoy equipping Godzilla with these new moves, I still had to trudge through more hours of this game's monotonous gameplay in order to unlock them. So after all of that, it was actually really nice to just chill in the diorama mode for an hour. All you're doing is just taking these little models of the characters and placing them around this diorama of one of the game's maps in order to create these little scenes that you can screenshot and save. I guess it says a lot about this game when I enjoyed posing these little figures more than I actually did playing the game. But ultimately, I really wanted to like this game. I didn't go in wanting to hate it. In fact, I don't hate it at all. As a Godzilla fan, there's a lot to love here. It's not the worst Godzilla game ever made, and it's certainly not the best. It's just boring. And that's honestly the worst thing a game could be, especially a game about giant monsters fighting each other and destroying buildings. And what makes that even worse is that this was a game I was extremely excited for, especially since we went so many years without a new Godzilla game. But that huge feeling of disappointment I felt when I played this game for the first time is exactly why I decided to make this video in the first place. Before playing this game, the only Godzilla games I ever played were the Pipeworks trilogy, and I already talked about how much Godzilla Unleashed disappointed me too. So after being massively disappointed, not once, but twice, I figured there had to be some other good Godzilla games out there besides the first two games in the Pipeworks trilogy. And I also hoped that even though many fans and critics didn't like this game, they would still continue to make more Godzilla games, and we'd even get another fighting game hopefully somewhere down the line. But after this game flopped, we got yet another drought of Godzilla games that we still haven't gotten out of since. Like I said in the beginning, Godzilla's 70th anniversary has been the biggest year for the franchise yet, even bigger than when this game came out in 2014. And yet despite all this new content we've been getting, they haven't tried capitalizing on the success by making a new game. So it's kind of a shame that for now, the last Godzilla game we got is this big ambitious project that not only ended up being a disappointment for many fans, but was a huge commercial failure that is now impossible to find and play for a reasonable price. And even though I've been very critical of this game, it still sucks for all the people that actually want to try and check it out. Especially since I know this game has its fans, and it's not hard to see why. I mean, this game is absolutely dripping with fan service, and you can tell the people making this game were big fans of the franchise. The monsters all look and sound exactly as they should, and there's a great selection of them to choose from. Plus, I think the opening cinematic of this game is genuinely great. I guess I just feel kind of bad for the devs who clearly poured all their heart and soul into this game. But it's not like this game is a complete failure, because I guess when it comes to what this game was trying to do, it definitely did achieve what it set out to do. I mean, the game certainly does look and feel like you're playing as Godzilla, and there's a ton of stuff in this game for die-hard fans to enjoy. So I guess if all you wanted out of this game was a big Godzilla anniversary experience, then you'll probably get some enjoyment out of this. But unfortunately for me, when it comes to this game, the cons just greatly outweigh all the pros. Stiff and clunky controls, excruciatingly slow movement, shallow combat, extremely repetitive gameplay, unsatisfying destruction, and no way to play with friends. I guess it just goes to show that even if you have a passionate group of people working on a game for the fans, it doesn't always guarantee success. I truly did want to like this game. It seemed like everything I could have asked for in a Godzilla game, but ultimately this game just ended up disappointing not only me, but many Godzilla fans and non-fans alike. I know that for this entire video, I've been making a big stink about how there hasn't been a new Godzilla game in a decade, but that isn't entirely true. The King of the Monsters hasn't been completely absent from the world of video games in recent years. Just last year, we got Godzilla Voxel Wars on PC, making this the first and only Godzilla game on Steam. But this game wasn't released by the time I started making this video, but even if it was, I probably wouldn't have reviewed it anyway. I mean, we've been waiting almost a decade for a new Godzilla game, and what we get is a cheap-looking turn-based strategy game with chibi voxel graphics. I mean, a lot of people don't even know this game exists, but that could also be because this game only released on PC. I'm not writing this game off completely, because who knows, maybe one day I'll play it and it ends up being a hidden gem. But that's not the only Godzilla game I didn't talk about in this video, because there were a bunch of games based on the 1998 American Godzilla. I never planned on including Zilla games in this list, and based on what I've seen for most of these games, I don't think I'm missing much. But there is one that kind of intrigued me, and that was Godzilla Online. It was a free-to-play multiplayer game where you select a class of humans to play as, and you have to fight against the baby Zillas. The Zillas are playable too, but there's no classes for them. This game actually looked pretty decent, at least as far as Zilla games go, especially since this one is an online multiplayer game, but unfortunately, that also means this game is impossible to play now. But even though we haven't gotten many Godzilla games in recent years, Toho has at least been much more open to the idea of crossovers. Well, not movie crossovers, because we still haven't gotten Godzilla vs. Gamera or the Shin Universe crossover movie, but in the past few years, we have seen Godzilla in many other video game franchises. They did a Godzilla and Kong cross-promotion in Call of Duty, there's Godzilla skins in Fall Guys, multiple characters in Giga Bash, and a free Dave the Diver DLC, but that one is only available for 6 months, and after that it's gone forever. That's really stupid, and I assume Toho had something to do with it, but to my knowledge, the Giga Bash DLC isn't going to go away anytime soon. But there was even a Godzilla DLC for the Bedrock edition of Minecraft, and it was surprisingly a very fun love letter to the franchise. I actually enjoyed that Minecraft DLC much more than I did the PS4 Godzilla game, so it is nice that Godzilla has been featured in many crossovers with various indie games in the past few years, but Godzilla crossovers aren't exactly a new thing in video games. There were 2 sports games exclusive to Japan that also feature Godzilla. The first one is called Battle Soccer, Champion of the Field, and it released in 1992 for the Super Famicom. Obviously this one is a soccer game, but for some reason you can play as characters from Gundam, Ultraman, Kamen Rider, and of course, Godzilla. And then a year later they made Battle Baseball, but for whatever reason, this one released on the Famicom and not the Super Famicom. Then as recently as 2017, we got a game for the PS4 called City Shrouded in Shadow. In this game, you're playing as a Japanese civilian, and you have to escape the city as it's being attacked by giant monsters. Some of these monsters are, of course, from Godzilla, but there's also ones from Ultraman, Neon Genesis Evangelion, and even Gamera. So I guess we did get that Godzilla-Gamera crossover after all, because as far as I know, this is the only game where Godzilla and Gamera are featured together. Well, none of the characters from the other franchises actually interact with each other, but they're all there. I always thought it would be cool to experience kaiju battles from the perspective of a human, so why couldn't we get this game in America? I mean, you can play this game on an American PS4, but with a game as dialogue heavy as this, I wouldn't really recommend it. There was another PS4 Godzilla game, but this one released exclusively for the PSVR, and it's more like one of those Universal Studio rides than a game. And that's not the only Godzilla VR game either, but all the other ones are exclusive to arcades. But one of the earliest examples of a Godzilla crossover in a video game was the Movie Monster game, which released in 1986 for the Commodore 64 and Apple II computers. This game is a parody of B-movies, and you get monsters like the Glog, which is clearly a parody of the Blob, Mechatron, which I assume is based on Megatron, but also sort of looks like a Gundam or Voltron. Then there's Mr. Meringue, which is clearly inspired by the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters, and Tarantus, which I assume is based on the 1955 movie Tarantula. But despite this game having all these parody characters, Godzilla is just Godzilla. They actually licensed the character for this game, when they could have just made some sort of Reptar-esque bootleg character. Well, it turns out they actually did, because this game is a sequel to a 1981 video game called Crush, Crumble, and Chomp, and that game features a parody of Godzilla called Goshzilla. Even though there aren't many Godzilla games being made anymore, there are still other kaiju games being made that could potentially scratch the same itch. If you're a fan of the Godzilla Pipeworks trilogy, then you should check out Giga Bash. It's an indie fighting game heavily inspired by those games, and it just released a new DLC where you can play as King Ghidorah and Hedorah. It's got native support for couch play, and it's a great time with friends. I could honestly make a whole video on just this game alone. If you want another similar type of game, then there's also SNK's King of the Monsters. It's an arcade game released in 1991, and much like Godzilla Domination, it features 4-player monster action, city destruction, and it definitely takes heavy inspiration from Godzilla himself. But then if you want something a bit more different, then there's War of the Monsters, which is a great multiplayer monster game, and the combat is unlike any of the other Godzilla games I've looked at today. Then there's also Dawn of the Monsters, which is another kaiju game that's fun to play with friends. It plays like a classic arcade-style beat-em-up, so if you're into those kind of games, I recommend checking it out. Then of course there's the Earth Defense Force series of games, which have you playing as a human soldier fighting against huge waves of giant bugs and monsters. I guess it's more like Starship Troopers than Godzilla, but the kaiju influence is definitely there. Although I guess it's also more like Helldivers 2, but this game is much more ridiculous than that. Then finally there's Kaiju Wars, which is a strategy game where you play as the military and have to stop the monsters from destroying everything. But what's neat about this one is that it leans into that trope that the military is constantly fighting a futile war against the kaiju that they're never going to win. So the game pretty much expects you to sacrifice many lives and resources as you fight them, because you're not even necessarily expected to defeat them. But if all these non-Godzilla games aren't scratching that itch, then maybe you can look into the world of Godzilla fan games. There aren't really that many of them, but there are some impressive ones. There are some pretty cool looking Godzilla games made in Roblox, like Kaiju Arisen and Kaiju Universe, but there's also a few official MonsterVerse tie-ins they did in Roblox. But one of the most classic Godzilla fan games is Godzilla Daikessen Battle Royale, which is a 2D flash game based on the old arcade fighters. Although it's certainly not as good as those Godzilla games, for an old fan game, it is pretty impressive. But if you want something more modern, then look no further than G-Fighter. It's a very impressive looking 2D fighting game with some beautiful sprites. Although unfortunately this game isn't available to play yet, but I'm looking forward to when it finally releases. There are also some mods of other Godzilla games that fans have made. Two examples of this are Godzilla Unleashed Overhaul and Godzilla Save the Earth Melee. These two mods use Godzilla Unleashed and Godzilla Save the Earth respectively as their framework, while also taking the best aspects of all the games in the Pipeworks trilogy to make these games even better. These mods each add new characters, stages, and even tweak the gameplay to make the combat feel even better. Coming from someone who loves Godzilla Save the Earth, I highly recommend checking out Save the Earth Melee. It makes an already great game even better. And as for Godzilla Unleashed Overhaul, this project pretty much is exactly what I was looking for. Not only because it has new characters and upgraded visuals, but there's no more forced motion controls. They make the gameplay much more like Godzilla Save the Earth. So if you too were disappointed by Godzilla Unleashed, then I also highly recommend checking out the Overhaul project. So of all the Godzilla games we looked at today, only about half of them released in America, and there's still a ton of Japanese exclusive I didn't even talk about, mostly because I physically can't. But despite that, I think we at least accomplished my goal of finding some hidden gems from this franchise. Games like Godzilla Arcade, Monster War, and Battle Legends were all fun fighting games. Godzilla Domination was also a good handheld port of a game I already had a lot of fondness for. I was also pleasantly surprised by Giant Monster March, which was a pretty fun strategy game. And I even enjoyed Godzilla Generation's Maximum Impact much more than I expected to. So at least it's good to know that Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee and Save the Earth aren't the only Godzilla games worth playing. Though the sad thing is, almost all those games I mentioned before are Japanese exclusive, while we in the West instead get games like Godzilla for NES and Super Godzilla. But at least all those games that I did enjoy are completely accessible to English speakers too. But even after playing all these Godzilla games, I still think that Godzilla Save the Earth is the best Godzilla game of all time. So I just hope one day, after 20 years, they finally make a game that surpasses it. So even though it may seem like the future of Godzilla games looks bleak, the King of the Monsters will still be featured in many new video games, and Kaiju games as a whole are still going strong. But even if we still don't get a new official Godzilla game for a long time, the dedicated fandom will always keep the franchise alive.